Welcome to the Computational Statistics and Machine Learning section workshop on interpretable machine learning and causal inference. So the first request, you've all been extremely good at this so far, which is for attendees to please mute your microphones and keep your video switched off at all times. I'll go into the way that we'll deal with questions in just a little bit, but for sort of bandwidth reasons, I guess video off is probably the most important thing here. So thanks very much for joining. I've covered the first two bits already. Please keep your microphones off and on mute and video off. So the way that we'll do questions is, I believe that when we did our little technical run through yesterday, we found that we were having some issues with the sharings of the screen, which require people to share their full screen, and so they might not be able to see what you're putting in the chat, or if you've got your hand raised. So what we'll do is I will try to monitor any questions that you type into the chat window, and any time you have a hand raised. And if it's appropriate, if there's an appropriate point during when the speaker is actually delivering their talk that it's suitable for me to raise that question with them, I can either cut in and either unmute or I can just read out the question that's in the chat. Or if that doesn't appear to be the case, then we can just go through the questions at the end of the talk. So anytime you think of a question, just it's probably best to just type it into the chat, and I'll keep a track of those. For those of you that will be joining the Computational Statistics and Machine Learning section annual general meeting, so that's really, I guess, just for the CSML committee at the moment, that will be held at the break at 2:20. So that's going to be a long break going until 3:05, and I think that'll be about 15 minutes for us. So everyone else, obviously, feel free to clock off then, go and get a cup of tea or whatever, and we'll just have that quick meeting then. And then one other last thing is that we are currently recording the talks, and these might be distributed at a later date. So if you don't want to be on any of the recordings, then please, if you could send an email to l.martinez@rss.org.uk, and so that's Lutz, and she'll edit you out, make sure you're edited out of any of the videos, and your participation won't be noted. Okay. So just a very quick introduction, because I think this event has been advertised on quite a few different channels. So we might well have people attending to whom the Royal Statistical Society is new. You don't necessarily know about it or our sections. So just a very, very quick overview. It's an organisation advocating for the importance of statistics and data in society, and that's based in the UK. It's the Royal Statistical Society. That's royal as in the British monarchy. Founded in 1834, it's a charitable organisation, but despite being based in the UK, it has over 10,000 members across the world, and holds activities worldwide. The Computational Statistics and Machine Learning section, so we renamed ourselves this year from just the Statistical Computing section to sort of more accurately reflect what the section is interested in. And the general sort of goal of the section is to support interest in all aspects of the use of computational science and technology in modern statistical analysis. But we're also interested in the methodological development of statistical and machine learning algorithms. So we try to run events that are along with those sort of goals, and we also submit sessions that occur at the Royal Statistical Society's annual conference. So if you're interested in joining, then we have a section page on the Royal Statistical Society website, and you can get all the information about how to join there. So why this workshop? This is a picture that I found when looking up Hot Topic, and it reminded me of the late 90s and early 2000s. I believe it's an American reference, really, if anyone's based in the US, of being a teenage goth. But anyway, the Hot Topic clothing store. Interpretable machine learning is officially a hot topic. Explainable AI is sort of, I guess, I would say the super field that contains the field of interpretable machine learning as a subfield of that. And it's official. I'd say it's officially a hot topic because pretty much every big technology company has research teams dedicated to studying explainable AI. They publish a lot of papers in the topic. There's a huge DARPA-funded program, so that's DARPA, the US Defense Funding Agency, funding research in explainable AI. It's really exploded over the past few years. And causal inference is also gaining in sort of popularity and itself. There's a very popular book that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that came out last year by Yuda Pearl, who's one of the key founders in a lot of causal methods. And increasingly, there's also some crossover into the sort of machine learning and deep learning universe with Turing Award winner Yoshua Bengio, who's one of the well-known pioneers of deep learning, suggesting that deep learning researchers really need to really start looking into causal inference as a way of constraining their models and making them more reliable and robust in the real world. Not to mention also that I forgot on this slide that causal inference is extremely useful in epidemiological modeling. And as we all know, epidemiology has been quite a useful subject over the past year. So there's the two together. We've sort of combined them here, partly because they're both of interest, but partly because there seem to be sort of obvious overlaps between them. So they're both attempts to address problems of interpretability or robustness in conventional statistical methods or machine learning methods. And the other kind of key overlap really is that a lot of causal explanations are one of the favored approaches to creating explanations by humans. There's an awful lot of social science research and philosophical work done that suggests that humans, when we're explaining things, we often explain things with causal mechanisms or through counterfactual examples and explanations. So there's a clear kind of overlap in the philosophy here. But there's also differences in how the fields are practiced. So that's both because of the methodologies and the communities that kind of gave rise to the two different research areas, but also, and I guess this might be challenged by some of the speakers later on, but my perception in particular really is that causal inference and causal modeling, what you're trying to do is build a model that reliably represents some process in the real world. Whereas in interpretable machine learning, you might do that, but it's not necessarily a main goal. What you're trying to do really is explain what a particular machine learning model has learned about the world. And it might be that what it's learned about the world is not necessarily a good representation of what's going on in the world. But the key point, it might still be useful, but the key point is that you want to explain the model, and you don't want to use the model to explain the world or the universe. And my perception is that that's in contrast with causal modeling, but hopefully we'll hear more about that in the talks that we have. So the goals of the workshop, we're going to hear some extremely interesting research. I've had a quick look over some of the slides that have come through, and I'm very excited to hear from them. We've got 4 very strong experts in these 2 areas. And I'm hoping that over the course of the talks, we'll be able to sort of consider the cross-fields implications of the work that they're all doing, and kind of think about areas where there might be interdisciplinary collaborative links that we can establish, or sort of further identify those fundamental contrasts that arise between the 2 fields. So that's sort of what I've considered as the main, hopefully the main outcomes that we're going to get, as well as advertising this kind of work to a broader audience, and hopefully getting some interesting discussion going at the end of the talks. So this is just a quick reminder of the schedule we have. So the first talk will be from Peter Tennant, and we'll be starting that in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to try and keep reasonably well to time, just in case people are joining and leaving, expecting talks to happen on schedule. We'll try and keep to that. We've got quite a few breaks, just short breaks in, and the larger break in the middle. And at the end, we've got some time after Vera's final talk. We have about a half an hour just for further questions and general discussion. So I'm not entirely sure how we're going to manage that yet. I suspect what we'll do is have people raise their hands, and then I'll try and direct, if there is kind of a conversation that we can have, I'll direct that by looking at people raising their hands or not. It depends on how many people stick around for that. It might just be that we're able to sort of let that run naturally. But if there are still lots of people who want to talk, then I'll have to try and herd the cats a bit more aggressively. So that's all I wanted to say at the start of this. I think now if I stop sharing, then Peter, you should be able to share yours.
Yeah, can you see and hear me?
Can do, yep. Oh,
Great.
sorry, we've got one, before we start, Peter, I've got one raised hand from Tony. Tony, can you unmute yourself and ask what he wants to ask? Tony Hay.
Sorry, that was a mistake. I apologize.
That's no problem at all. It's good to know that the hand raising is working.
Yeah, thank you. Took me some time to find the mute button. Thank you.
Yeah, often does. That's no problem. Okay, in that case, I'll hand you over to Peter, and I'll keep monitoring the chats and the hands up for questions. So over to you, Peter. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Richard. So thank you to everyone who's logged in. I think this is going to be quite an interesting afternoon, and Richard has already alluded to why, which is that in a sense there are two different schools coming at this question of interpretation, transparency, explainability, etc. Now, I should say up front, I come from the Causal Inference school. So my background is in epidemiology, but in the last few years, I've very much moved, as has much of the field, towards adopting a more causal focused approach to my research. And that's increasingly taking up all of my research. And what I'm going to talk about today is why we need more than just a transparent model in order to achieve interpretation. But that is going to touch on those philosophical differences that have already been alluded to. And the example that I'll use to try and demonstrate this is something known as the table 2 fallacy, which is quite well known within epidemiology communities, but it would be interesting to know how far it's kind of spread beyond that. So what do we know about algorithms? Well, we know that they're taking over our world one way or another, that we are using pattern recognition, we're using them for pattern recognition, we're using them for profiling, we're using them for decision making, and that this is happening across the board: speech and language recognition, classifying and labeling images, screening job applications, approving insurance and loans, diagnosing diseases, informing the appropriate treatments, the advertisements you see on your screen, and indeed probably how much something costs, and then even the very things that you see on your social media feeds. But we also know that algorithms have serious issues. The first of them, and I think it's important to say this, particularly to a statistical community, they are fundamentally unsuited to individual level prediction and decision making. And if you want to know why, then an interesting read on this essentially is The Hidden Half, which tells you about the fact that we live in a world that is governed by probability. And so while statistics is absolutely brilliant at allowing us to make comparisons between groups, it's really not very useful at making inferences at the individual level. And this is something that we described in a recent paper in Lancet Digital Health. Although statistics and hence machine learning is excellent at helping us understand and compare probabilities between groups, it is fundamentally unable to tell us what will happen to an individual. But then there's this other problem, which is that something that is primarily data-driven, as most algorithms will be, means that they are, whilst excellent at very good at identifying patterns and associations within those data, they have no understanding of what those patterns and associations mean. And so that means that they are very, very good at encoding and indeed magnifying prejudices and biases. I'm using those terms in kind of inverted commas at the moment within the data. And so what that means is that many data-driven algorithms are going to end up being morally and socially regressive if they're used in a way that does not appreciate that inherent kind of pattern recognition that's taking place. And that is one of the bases behind this fascinating book, which I would recommend to anyone who's involved in data science, Weapons of Math Destruction. Which is a book about, in a sense, the emergence and the dominance of some very, very opaque algorithms that are making decisions with some quite dangerous consequences for us. Now, there's been a very, very useful, if extremely simple, example of the problems of kind of naive algorithms earlier this year with Occam's A-level results algorithm. But what's interesting about that algorithm, with the equation for which is kind of shown on the bottom right, is that the output performance when taken as a group was very reasonable. It just failed, as you would expect, at an individual level. And the thing that attracted the most attention is that it exposed the biases that we already have within our society. So students from less advantaged schools were systematically downgraded in their grades. But was that the algorithm's fault? Because a lot was written about how flawed this algorithm actually was. But if the exams had gone ahead, you would have seen exactly the same disadvantage take place. So there is a wider question that we have to ask about bias and justice within society, but equally we can try and transfer that to the way we think about designing our algorithms and considering our algorithms, and realize that if equity and justice is something that we desire, then in designing and scrutinizing our algorithms, well, in designing them, we need to incorporate agnostic and fair features, and we need to ignore prejudice and unfair ones, and we need to scrutinize algorithms to maximize fairness and reduce unintended consequences. And supposedly, one way to do this, one way to enhance what you might call algorithmic justice, is to design more explainable and interpretable algorithms. The problem is, what do we actually mean by that? And if you look through the literature, then you are going to get debate all over the place. If you look specifically in the computer science literature, it's very much focused on features of the algorithm. But if you step outside that, for example, to the social science literature, then there is a convergence of argument around causality. In other words, as these two individuals state, for example, explainability is the assignment of causal responsibility. Interpretability is the degree to which an observer can understand the cause of a decision. And in the common vernacular, if you think about what it means when you ask someone, can you explain that to me? Or what does this mean? You are asking, why has this decision taken place? You are asking, what was the mechanism behind this? So broadly, I would argue, but others may not, and that may prove to be a very interesting discussion, that an explainable or interpretable algorithm is one where the reasons for a decision can be queried and explained in a way that makes sense to humans. Now, as an additional benefit to that, and the obvious ethical implications that that brings, one thing that I think is being demonstrated and is perhaps driving some of the interest is that explainable interpretable algorithms also promise greater reliability because they can be more transportable. And so that means, taken together, if we have more ethical and more reliable algorithms, then these could lead to greater trust and confidence, become, in a sense, more persuasive at their arguments, leading to greater adoption, and overall, ideally, become more effective. But of course, a lot of the discussion around algorithms and a lot of the concern is at the other extreme, that what we have going on with many of the algorithms being designed are black box systems or black box algorithms. So these are where, in a sense, you have an opaque model, And it is not clear why those decisions are being made. The data went in, something happened, and then a decision had come out the other end. And clearly these are not natively compatible with the notion of interpretability, because what we do know, therefore, is that they may encode prejudices and they may contain features that are extremely specific to that particular data set that do not transport very well. So that has driven a kind of parallel argument towards creating more transparent algorithms. Okay, and in fact, there's a you can see this kind of language occurring within government and official documentation calling for more algorithmic transparency in order that we can have more accountability. So this is something from the EU on the left and something from the Federal Trade Commission in the US on the right. And that encourages research such as this, symbolic meta-modeling. This is an approach to create increased transparency where a white box model, to use the author's terms, is produced that mimics the performance of the black box in order to allow you to see what's going on. I mean, I would argue a transparent box would be a better analogy, but the argument is fairly clear that once you have a transparent system, then in theory you should be able to extract features, determine the relative importance. And this is from the FTC. They say, you know, if you use algorithms, disclose the key factors that affected the score and the rank order for importance. So this is something that's not just seen as useful within the technical world, but is also seen as useful by government representatives. But being able to identify and describe the feature of an algorithm does not make those features remotely interpretable. Okay, this is an illusion, because in a data-driven prediction model, the features have no real-world meaning. They represent an obscure combination of variables, both inside and outside the model. So they shouldn't really be ranked. They shouldn't be described or interpreted, never mind things like relative importance. And I'm going to try and explain why with the example of the table 2 fallacy. So the thing is that interpretability and explainability requires understanding causes and effects. And that cannot be determined from the data alone. It requires understanding of the data generating mechanism. In other words, a combination of the context that you're examining, the data lineage, where it's all come from, how it's been processed, the sampling and selection processes that took place that mean that certain people, for example, are in your data and others are not. And then more fundamentally than that, the meaning and the relationship between those variables. So interpretability, I would argue, requires a causal model, because knowledge of the data generating process can only come from external theory and understanding, i.e. a causal model. Because a software or an algorithm cannot currently do this alone. A data-driven prediction model, therefore, cannot be interpreted. It doesn't matter how transparent you have made it, it will have no real-world meaning. And the reason for that is essentially this fundamental difference, that whereas data is created according to some causal process, an algorithm at best understands that the output that you have labeled as, say, your outcome, and then a series of input variables as equivalent. And this speaks to the fundamental difference at the heart of modeling and a lot of analysis, which is the difference between what we might call a predictive approach and a predictive model, or a causal approach and a causal model. The predictive model fundamentally is focused simply on predicting values of the outcome. It is outcome focused, whereas a causal model is focused on trying to estimate causal effects. Okay, so if you compare these two things side by side, you can see how, whilst we might imagine they're quite similar, they're actually radically different in their aims and interpretation. The predictive model predicts values of the outcome. The causal model seeks to estimate a causal effect. The predictive model seeks to maximize the variance explained, whereas the causal model seeks to maximize the accuracy of the estimate. And the consequences of that for your variable selection is that, for example, whereas in a predictive model, you would try and balance precision and parsimony, in a causal model, you're trying to bring in knowledge and judgment. In a predictive model, you're interested in the availability of the variables, but in the causal model, the role. And so ultimately, in a predictive model, you're trying to maximize the joint information to provide the best outcome variation. But in the causal model, it's all about minimizing confounding and selection bias. And the consequence of that is that whereas in a predictive model, the coefficients are uninterpretable, we're hoping in a causal model they are interpretable. So let's try and give a simple example. I'm using COVID a lot in my examples at the moment, just because there's an awful lot of research that can be used for such examples. So this is one that was published back in June about the relationship between baldness and the risk of severe COVID. And I think it's quite a nice example because as soon as it was published, eyebrows were raised. But we could imagine that we produced a predictive model that looks like this. Baldness predicts death from COVID-19. There we are. We rank the relative importance of this model as 100% important. But of course, that has absolutely no meaning because we've got to imagine what else is going on. It's obvious to begin with that clearly you're more likely to be bald if you're male. And we already know that men are at a higher risk of death from COVID-19. But then the other more obvious one, the one that everyone pointed out and that was not considered in that study, was age. So how important is baldness really? Well, very important in our original model. But once we actually consider the context, it would be vanishingly important. And of course, it gets more complicated. These don't have to be things that just cause baldness. There can be other unrelated things that are related to death from COVID, that cause death from COVID-19, but are related to baldness through other mechanisms we haven't even understood. So the idea that we can simply extract meaningful features from a model without being aware of the context that goes in, I think, is nonsense. Of course, the pushback you might give is that, well, this is a classic, this is omitted variable bias. Our sense of how important baldness is being skewed by the fact that we've missed out various important features. Well, it's more complicated even than that, because actually, even if we had accounted for age, how well had we accounted for age? I don't know what model we've necessarily used for this, but theoretically, there will always be some residual effect of other variables taking place. So not only is it the variables that you haven't got, but it's also how well you've modeled the variables that you have got. But even so, theoretically, you might argue if we connect enough variables, then surely this isn't a problem. This is just, omitted variable bias. Well, let's look at this example. This has 16 or 17 odd predictors or risk factors for COVID-19 related death. And it's obviously good because it was published in Nature earlier this year by Ben Goldacre's team at Oxford. And they have figures and tables that look something like this, where we have a whole series of the adjusted hazard ratios for each of these different variables. Now, I'm using this quite simple example of a linear regression with individual additive coefficients because it is absolutely transparent. You know, these are the adjusted hazard ratios in this model. But what I'm going to do is now discuss, is it just omitted variable bias that's the problem? Well, we need to take a step back and remember, with a causal approach, you seek to estimate a causal effect. And to do that, you have to first identify the thing you want to know, the estimand. And it is the estimand that informs the appropriate model. So, in other words, if we seek to bake this Olaf cake on the left, the estimand, that we've identified first tell us what is the appropriate estimator for that estimand. And from that estimator, we can produce our estimate. There's an inverse, there's an inverse implication of this. Meaningful estimates require well-defined estimands and an appropriate estimator. So, one way that we can identify our desired estimand is directed acyclic graphs. I'm not going to go into these in great detail, but I'm going to say that they are essentially a formalized way in which we a non-parametric representation of the causal relationships that we believe are taking place. Okay, so what you do is you draw nodes, which represent, say, variables, and then you have arcs between them, which indicate what you believe to be the causal processes taking place. And it's a very simple, but a very powerful way to encode that external knowledge of the data generating mechanism that is fundamentally required in order to make interpretations of what is going on. So if we wanted to seek a causal effect, this is classic causal inference. Let's say the causal effect of x3 on y in this kind of simple diagram. Then our aim would be that we have to try and close all of the confounded paths. These are all the associations that are in a sense due to those common causes, like in the case of baldness, age and sex. So if x3 was baldness, age would be x1 and sex would be x2, whilst keeping the causal paths open. So what a traditional epidemiologist would call the things on the causal pathway, the mechanisms through which x3 acts on y. That's how we would seek the total causal effect of x3. And then in kind of conceptual terms, moving towards our estimator, that means what we want to do is we want to condition on all of the confounders, but none of the mediators. So in a linear regression sense, that would mean we'd want to include the confounders as covariates. But likewise, we could equally throw all of our confounders at a machine learning algorithm to try and work out an appropriate way of adjusting for them. But that model, right? So let's say we have this model down at the bottom right representing that our outcome includes our exposure and the confounders and a competing exposure. That model was designed to estimate that causal effect. The same model is not appropriate for interpreting the other coefficients, because those coefficients, if we want to extract something meaningful from them, we would need to be creating a different estimator. If we wanted the total causal effect, let's say, of x1, then we'd have to think, what is the appropriate adjustment set for x1? That is not the adjustment set, in a sense, that is taking place within this model. So if we try to interpret the coefficient of x1, we would get something very different. And it would be very, very different because we've conditioned on x3, which we know to be a mediator of part of the effect of x1. Now you might think, okay, so what? You know, that just gives me the partitioned causal effect of x1. It's not that big a deal. I can still understand it as some kind of residual causal element. Well, it's more complicated than that. And indeed, that assumption that you can interpret all of the predictors in a single model as having some kind of external meaning is a fallacy. And it's been dubbed the table 2 fallacy, because in traditional epidemiology, we would often present this model predicting the outcome with all the different coefficients, and we would then interpret it as table 2, having presented the general description of the data in table 1. And so we go back to Williamson et al., the Open Safely paper in Nature, and we realize that what's taking place there, again, is a table 2 fallacy. And let's have a look through some of the hazard ratios. So what I'm actually telling you is that you shouldn't. That these hazard ratios as individual numbers have no meaning whatsoever. They are part of a total model of risk Their joint information is the thing that predicts the outcome and that is potentially useful, but the individual information of each coefficient is an arbitrary construction based on the other variables we have in the model and the ones we don't. Now, you may not notice that if you look down many of these variables at a glance. So you might say, well, let's have a look at age. Okay, yeah, increasing age, increasing risk of death. That makes sense. Sex, male at higher risk of death. Yep, that makes sense. Increasing obesity, higher risk of death. Yep, that makes sense. I should tell you, you're being deceived. We do not know really what is going on for each of these variables, but they all seem benign. It's only when you spot something like this that you might start asking questions. Oh, look, current smoking seems to be protective of death. Oh dear. Well, what are we going to do about that? Well, of course, typically an epidemiologist would mutter something about there was a surprising result for smoking, but never mind, it's probably some kind of artifact. Well, it's an artifact of the fact that you cannot interpret the coefficients in this model. It just so happens that the artifact in this case is particularly large. So what we have is this scenario. We're interested in the relationship between smoking and death from COVID-19, let's say, and we know that there will be some kind of mediating variables within that. That's normal. There'll always be mediating variables. But we know from our theory that we shouldn't be conditioning on mediating variables if we're interested in estimating the total causal effect. Now, you might think it doesn't matter, I get some kind of partition causal effect. That's certainly what traditional path analysis would tell you. But that is only in a world where you know everything, and you don't. Because in reality, there will always be other causes. So let's take this example that in general, we understand that smoking raises the risk of diabetes, and we can imagine that smoking should lead to a higher risk of death from COVID-19. Well, if you look at the unadjusted relationship between smoking and current smoking and death, it fits the direction we would expect. Clearly, that's going to be confounded, but it's at least in the direction we would expect. But in the model, where there will be many adjustments like this is one example, diabetes, but there'll be other variables that are caused by smoking and therefore sit in between smoking and death from COVID-19, you will induce a problem. Okay, so we imagine that all we actually do is take out the part of smoking that would otherwise act through diabetes. But in fact, diabetes is a collider. It is a collider for all other causes of diabetes. Of course, smoking leads to diabetes, so does everything else that leads to diabetes. If any one of those things also leads to death from COVID-19, it is now, in a sense, in competition with smoking. And because we have conditioned on diabetes, which is a collider for all of these unknown things, we invoke here, this curly dotted line, a conditional dependency between smoking and literally every other joint cause of diabetes and death from COVID-19 that was not in our model. Now, there will be many of those, and some of them will be a lot worse than smoking. And so what happens is you end up in that model with an apparent reverse of the association. Good Lord, smoking is now protective. It's not, because it's not smoking. It is some joint effect of which the smoking coefficient in our model is mopping up a small element of. And we can see other examples. You might not be so convinced by that one, but there is another one which is much more plain if you look through their model, where that you see that this trio of variables, high blood pressure, that leads to a higher risk of COVID-19. It also leads to a higher risk of heart disease, which in turn leads to a higher risk of COVID-19. In the unadjusted model, which will be confounded, higher blood pressure is associated with a higher risk of death from COVID-19. But in the adjusted model, the association flips. Again, very likely because we now have some kind of bizarre joint effect between blood pressure and every other cause of heart disease and death from COVID-19. It doesn't matter whether you collected information on it or not. It is in there in the data. It is part of the data generating mechanism. Now, I have picked out the two most extreme examples, the ones where the effects reverse from what is probably really going on causally. But every single coefficient within that model, where there is a mediator that has also been adjusted for, so that's, in a sense, everything other than the one that is closest to the outcome will suffer this effect. It's just that in some cases it will be much larger than others. So when we go back and we go through all those individual little hazard ratios and we try and interpret them, it's nonsense. So what we have here is inappropriate interpretation of a model that is not, of a predictive model. You cannot make causal interpretations from a predictive model. Now, there was an outcry when the draft of this paper was published as a preprint. And as a result, a lot of the causal language was removed before the final paper in Nature. And so luckily, you see that the paper says we caution against interpreting our estimate of causal effects. But here is the most sinister aspect of producing a transparent model that has no practical meaning. It doesn't matter what you warn in your discussion. People will interpret anyway. We call this Pavlovian inference. It is our nature, in a sense, as human beings, to draw causal inferences from these kind of situations. So this is Eric Topol, who's a bit of evidence-based medicine a titan in America, constantly tweeting about COVID, obviously picked up this paper. The main thing I want to show is he highlights the risk factors and says, but there's no risk factor for hypertension, and current smoking appears to be protective. And Ben Goldacre tries to jump in and says, no, the data don't show that smoking is protective. We're very clear. You can't draw causal inferences. It's too late. You made a model. You made it transparent, but the coefficients were meaningless. So people are going to interpret. And it's more serious than someone like Eric Topol just saying, oh, smoking is protective. In France, and indeed in many other countries, the definition of who is vulnerable and therefore entitled, for example, to furlough was informed by the hazard ratios in that study. So this chap here, who actually led a legal case against the French government, demonstrated that they were using the hazard ratios from that model to inform who was vulnerable and who was not, even though those hazard ratios are meaningless. Now that got overturned, thankfully, and it got overturned thanks to expert testimony from a number of individuals on Twitter, a number of epidemiologists who this chap contacted. But the message is absolutely vital, okay? And I've exemplified it with a completely transparent additive linear model. This is an incredibly simple model. It just has a series of terms. And I'm telling you, those terms have no meaning. And we could show you a 3-variable model, the one with baldness. 2-variable, baldness and the outcome. It has no meaning. But those issues apply to all predictive models. Okay, so the features that you think you are seeing are not what we think they are. They are some context-specific joint combination of associations and dependencies that are completely determined by the localized circumstances of your model and the data. So the variables inside and outside. Okay, and that is one of the key reasons, I believe, why data-driven algorithms are so sensitive to contextual changing and so vulnerable to adversarial manipulation. So I'm going to summarize now. My summary is data-driven algorithms clearly are very, very good at identifying and utilizing patterns and associations with our data, within our data. But in doing so, they're very good at encoding and magnifying unfair and prejudiced patterns. Designing explainable and interpretable algorithms is arguably one way to try and ensure more reliable, ethical, and transportable algorithms. But although an interpretable algorithm is by definition transparent, a transparent algorithm is not necessarily interpretable. And that is because true interpretability requires, absolutely fundamentally requires, causal understanding. And that's demonstrated very simply with the table 2 fallacy, where we have a whole series of extremely transparent coefficients that at best are useless and at worst may be dangerously misleading. Thanks very much. That's the end of my presentation. I will now unshare my screen.
Thanks very much, Peter. That's great. So we've got some questions coming in. That was a very stimulating presentation, and we've got quite a few questions. What I'm going to do is go through sort of it as not in the order they came in, because I think there are some that are more pertinent to the stuff that you've just been talking about. So there's a question from Louise Schroeders, who asks, are you saying it would be more appropriate to include only unadjusted hazard ratios in table 2 and then one single hazard ratio of the whole model?
This is actually one of the discussions that followed, and most epidemiologists would agree that, as Louise suggests, the unadjusted represent a fair description of what's going on crudely within the data. You know, it is true that at a crude level, for example, this is associated, you know, being male is associated with a higher risk. But there's no suggestion that that is causal. Nobody would ever interpret it in that way. But you're absolutely right. As soon as you then have an adjusted model, then people will start to make these Pavlovian inferences. And so we would argue where the only aim is truly predictive, and I'm not sure how often that's the case, but if you really do just have the aim of predicting, therefore of identifying people who are going to die, even though there's nothing you can do about it, then that should perhaps just be a black box, because it's more dangerous to present the internal kind of mechanisms to the world when there is this very high chance of them being misinterpreted. So yeah, I guess my answer to Louise, you can't give a summary hazard ratio. What you can do, I guess, from a model is summarize, you know, a group or an individual person's risk.
And I guess a similarly related question from Isabel Corkley is, how much would including interactions between variables has helped, or is the issue coming entirely from missing variables?
Interactions is merely a more sophisticated way of parameterizing your model. It makes absolutely no difference to the interpretability. I mean, arguably, of course, it perhaps usefully makes the model more difficult to interpret, because it still provides no causal meaning. It makes no difference to whether or not the coefficients by themselves actually have any value to the outside world.
So they had a question from Carla Diaz Ordaz, which is, isn't the issue with COVID research, especially in the early stages, that we do not have any external knowledge on which to base a DAG? And studies such as Open Safely were just trying to generate hypothesis and add to the body of evidence. How do you suggest researchers start a causal analysis when we know nothing about a new disease?
We know surprisingly a lot about the way that disease in general develops within a population. We know in general that, for example, we can hypothesize that there will be differences by socioeconomic position, differences by ethnicity, differences by sex. When we know we're dealing with a respiratory disease, unless we really get drilled down to the very specific mechanism, it can become surprisingly simple to create plausible starting points from which you can then start to estimate more plausible causal effects. Clearly, at an early stage, she's right that you would never get a perfect causal effect. But that's it. Where if you agree that, and you agree therefore all you should do is descriptive analyses, then why do an adjusted model? The adjusted model is either designed to predict risk, and if that's true, all that matters is how well the model works as a prediction model. Or it shouldn't be there at all, because really we're interested in causal inference or description. And so when we do this kind of traditional approach of kind of halfway house, then no, we're not. I don't think we're actually helping. I think we're actually just causing more confusion.
Got a question from Ian Hamilton. By the way, sorry, Tony Hay, your camera's on. I don't know if he wants to turn it off so that we're not intruding into your room. Thank you. Ian Hamilton asks, when humans make judgments, oh no, sorry, I was going to maybe leave that question to later on in the afternoon, but does what constitutes causal transparency depend on who is impacted? So for example, if I have a causal model that estimates the probability that someone will re-offend while on parole, is it sufficient that it is fully interpretable to a small number of statisticians for it to be applied to parole decisions?
I mean, I would argue that the boundary of interpretability is essentially, is it suitable? Well, the main thing is it suitable for interpretation and is it not? And in that kind of situation, what will almost always will have happened is someone will have built a predictive model of repeated offence. And now we have all of the problems we had before. Is that actually appropriate for that individual? I would argue no. It is appropriate for group level decisions, but it is not necessarily appropriate for informing individual decisions because you are bringing prejudices and biases to the table that do not necessarily apply to that individual. If you then want to make anything, if you then want to ask who is it appropriate, who should it be interpretable to, that's kind of a second layer. Ideally, I think everyone. But clearly, there are going to be models where contextual understanding is in fact, many situations where the contextual understanding means a lot. So the model will have to be designed with that input. I would be inherently uncomfortable if it was only interpretable to certain groups. I think a truly interpretable model, if we go back to that earlier definition of it being one that makes sense to humans, I think in general, it should make, you should be able to ask why is it making this recommendation? And we should be able to say, well, because they've done X, Y, and Z. You know, it should be that simple in my view. And it can be done. I mean, it doesn't matter how complex the model is. If it's built from the ground up with a causal perspective, you can then provide those kind of causal answers without needing to know what's going on under the bonnet.
Thanks, Peter. So we've officially got the break scheduled now. I'm just going to ask one more question because I think it's probably quite a good one for addressing some misconceptions, and then we'll have a break and come back at 2 o'clock for Nomi's talk. So the final question is from Tom Dieter. Is a directed acyclic graph enough? Even if we have a DAG and perform Bayesian inference, this is still not a causal model unless we can perform interventions.
Well, I mean, a causal model is a model of the data generating process, and a DAG is that. I'm not saying it's a statistical model. We build then an estimator based on our DAG. Our DAG may be flawed. In fact, we can assume it's always going to be inaccurate to some degree. But there's a philosophical difference here insofar as clearly, the best evidence of causality comes from observing the impact of real-world intervention in experimental conditions. But in the rest of for 99% of social and health science questions, we can't do that. So we have to approach the best way to achieve an estimate. Now, it will always be wrong, but how wrong? And it can still be incredibly useful and can still be surprisingly close to the truth. I would argue that is miles ahead from the old-fashioned approach of simply throwing everything at a model and pulling all the handles and then post hoc trying to interpret the machinery of something that has no theory underneath it whatsoever.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. That was a great way to open the meeting. I'm very sorry to the people whose questions we didn't have quite time to get to, but what I'm going to do is try and note them down. And if we have time during the final half-hour discussion, I'll try and sort of make sure that they get raised and we can have a chat about them then. So if you have more questions, then keep them coming and I'll keep monitoring them. But for now, we've got a couple of minutes until the top of the hour when we'll just have a break for comfort break or get a drink or whatever you like. So see you in a couple of minutes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we should probably get started again then. So the next talk is from Nomi Krief from, I really apologise, I've never checked the pronunciation of your surname, but I assume that's correct, Nomi.
Krief, but that's
Krief.
fairly close. Yeah.
My apologies. So she'll be talking about using causal machine learning to explore heterogeneous responses to policies. So when you're ready, thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the previous talk. It was very, very stimulating and thought provoking. And I feel that well, it's good that I'm not trying anything as ambitious as trying to interpret a whole bunch of coefficients and the effects of a whole bunch of exposures in my talk. What we are going to do here is something I think much more conservative, which is trying to estimate the causal effect of a single well-defined policy and trying to use machine learning to serve this estimation process. Where we are going a little bit further and where we are maybe getting a little bit more ambitious than the usual policy evaluation is that we want to explore heterogeneity in these responses. And this is where, I try to convince you that machine learning can play a role and can help us answer questions which perhaps without the machine learning couldn't have even asked before. So the objective is to give you a brief demonstration on how causal machine learning can support research in health policy evaluation. This is my field and my background. My background is in economics and my field of research is health economics. And over the last 10 years or so, I have been becoming increasingly passionate about using the formal toolkit of causal inference and increasingly adopting the toolkit of machine learning to do so. So the target of our estimation, the target of our inference today is around heterogeneity in policy effects. The method which I'm going to zoom into is an increasingly popular statistical approach, which uses machine learning, starts to blend and merge the advantages of the two approaches, causal forests. And the application which I'm going to present is based on a working paper, which I give you the reference later. It's joint work with colleagues from the University of York and elsewhere. It's an evaluation of the impact of health insurance on maternal healthcare utilization in Indonesia. So going back a little bit to the motivation in my field, which is somewhere on the border of the health and social sciences, most questions are of causal nature. We ask questions such as, did a new cancer drug improve survival of patients? Did introducing sugar tax in a country reduce obesity? Or did introducing universal health insurance improve access to healthcare? This third example is the running example of this talk. And I think many of you won't find this as surprising. Ideally, to draw causal inferences, we would want to compare outcomes in two words, one of which is counterfactual. Ideally, every single person undergoing a policy, in this case, it will be pregnant women in Indonesia. We would want to see their outcomes with and without the policy, with and without having health insurance. And we would hope that with having health insurance, they would have better health outcomes due to being able to utilize healthcare more often. So this is really what the kind of thought experiment which we are into. Of course, we cannot do this. We cannot replicate pregnant women in Indonesia. And this is what's often coined the fundamental problem of causal inference. How, again, in my field, we tend to address the fundamental problem of causal inference? Well, in health research, we can often randomize. We can randomize patients to receive different drugs, treatments. And even randomization has become very mainstream in economics to the extent that in 2019, the Nobel Prize has actually been given to a team of economists who have been using approaches of randomization in answering research questions regarding global poverty. Of course, we cannot always randomize, and the sort of questions I am working on in my research are those when we need observational studies to try to address causal questions. Well, I think this slide, we could spend the whole afternoon here and kind of debate how hard it is, how possible it is. But the bottom line is, and I hope that Peter would agree with me on this one, that in order to draw causal inferences from observational studies, we need a combination of assumptions. This can come from theory, external knowledge. They can be encoded using DAGs, and we need to fit statistical models. For example, to adjust for the observed differences between treated and control populations. And this is hard. It's hard to convince ourselves that the assumptions are actually valid, and it's not a trivial task to fit the statistical models. And because of these challenges, observational studies aiming to evaluate policies often stop at something which they can do, which is estimating average effects. However, policymakers, they need information beyond the average. They ideally would like to get some useful output on how treatment effects vary. But is there a heterogeneity in the effects we estimate? For example, did a policy work for a given group? Did the most vulnerable benefit from health insurance? Or maybe it was some other groups who were not really the target of the policy making. Who were the relative winners or losers? How could decision makers design better programs in the future based on what we learn? In classical trial-based research, it is possible to pre-specify subgroups. For example, check the efficacy of a drug for patients with well-defined profiles of risks, comorbidity, age perhaps, and given sample size constraints, we can conduct subgroup analysis and estimate causal effects for subgroups. In observational studies, it's very rare that pre-specified analysis plans are presented. And it's quite conceivable, and I'm sure that everyone has seen, perhaps people considering it, it is possible to cherry pick subgroups where we present results only for those where we actually find something significant. This is not a good practice. This is not a transparent practice. However, it is consistent with our human desire of finding something interesting with our cognitive biases. The question is whether we can do better than that, whether we can use the data, whether we can use the emerging toolkit from machine learning to actually say something relevant about how policy effects vary by observed characteristics of the population, but without the risks of cherry picking. And this is a very, very active area of methodological research recently in causal inference. I am not going to do this entire research area any justice in this talk. I'm going to pick one approach and I'm going to demonstrate how this can help us. So the study which I am going to use in this talk attempts to evaluate a really large health insurance expansion in Indonesia. Indonesia is a country of 270 million people, and it has made extremely large attempts in the last decades to increasingly give people health insurance, starting those working with the formal sector, who would pay for contributory health insurance from their payroll, and then continuing with those who are not employment due to being poor, giving them free or subsidized health insurance. And up to today, 20% of the population is still uninsured. So the question whether health insurance actually works, whether the sort of investment which a health Ministry of Health can make by redirecting taxes into publicly funded healthcare. We need some information on whether this works, whether it really improves health outcomes, whether it improves access to health, and if it works, how do these impacts vary among population subgroups? For example, do the poor population subgroup benefit? Do those whose education is low benefit? Do the rural subgroups benefit? And in general, what other dimensions, what other characteristics are there which can give the policymaker some information about potentially better designing this program? The data we are using is survey data. It's retrospective birth cohort data of around 10,000 observations, 10,000 births. I'm giving you this information because I often get questions about how big data you need to use machine learning to help you with causal inference questions. So this is 10,000 observations, and we have around 50 covariates we're going to use for various purposes, and the outcomes we're considering are binary outcome, whether a woman utilizes a medical professional at birth, so whether they give birth attended by a skilled health professional. And the treatment we are considering is whether a woman has health insurance, and this treatment has two versions. So we have subsidized and contributory health insurance. So introducing our classical toolkit of the causal inference framework, we have for each woman two potential outcomes: the mode of giving birth, if insured, and if being uninsured. And of course, we only observed a potential outcome, the one which actually happened. If we could observe both, then we could define the individual level causal effect by simply the difference of the two potential outcomes. But because without further assumptions, and really without any reasonable assumptions, it's not possible to derive individual level causal effect estimates, or target of estimation or target of or causal estimate will be around the average to start with. So instead of trying to go for the individual, what we can say, well, let's try to say something about what would have happened if we give everyone health insurance versus not giving anyone health insurance. This is the average treatment effect. We can ask different questions. How much those who actually had the health insurance have benefited from having it compared to not having it? Or a third question, how much those who did not have the health insurance would have benefited from actually having it? I would argue that for this particular policy question, where we still have people who are uninsured, it is maybe the most relevant actually for decision making. And to go further than an average, to keep my promise, we also would like to see how the expected treatment effect varies by covariates. So this causal estimate is referred to as the conditional average treatment effect function. Why is it a function? Because instead of asking what would be the average impact for the whole population, we put that x on the right-hand side of the equation. So we would like to know how this treatment effect would vary according to observed characteristics. So what can be these characteristics? This can be wealth, education, rural status, and many others, which we think may influence how much a woman benefits from having health insurance. If there were only a few covariates which we conceivably think can influence how much women would benefit from this policy, we would be okay with just conducting a couple of subgroup analyses. However, as soon as we have many covariates, and we have covariates which are continuous, this becomes a high-dimensional problem. So this is a challenge, and starting to introduce kind of machine learning ideas. Ideally, we would like to have some sort of algorithm which inputs a woman's characteristics, such as their age, household income, where they reside, whether it's their first, second, or third child, and running this through some sort of algorithm, we would get the predicted individual specific gain from having health insurance. Now, I would like to refer back to Peter's warning about never being able to use data for individual level decision making, and this might be a point of debate here as well. What we really mean here, and what we can feasibly hope for, is not a treatment effect specific to an individual. It's a treatment effect specific to very smaller and smaller subgroups of individuals, all having the same characteristics. So this will be important in how we can interpret the results we are getting later. Regardless of whether we are going for the average treatment effect or this conditional average treatment effect function, this more challenging estimate, we need our assumptions. So one alternative way of expressing our causal assumptions, which doesn't require us drawing DAGs, is by expressing it as the independence of potential outcomes from the treatment, conditional on observed covariates. So in this particular study, we have spent a lot of time and energy to carefully think, to contact our Indonesian collaborators, to convince ourselves that we have observed everything which influences whether a woman would have health insurance or not, and which would also predict whether a woman would otherwise utilize health services at birth or not. So but now we have a range of covariates we can use for our adjustment. And another very important assumption, which is somewhat more verifiable than the no unmeasured confounders assumption, is the so-called overlap or positivity assumption, which requires that there are no characteristics which perfectly predict insurance status. So this sounds technical, but it's actually a very important one. If the Indonesian Ministry of Health made sure that certain rules are perfectly followed, and only, for example, only those women who are strictly under certain cutoff of income, household income, are eligible for subsidized health insurance, then we would not have an overlap in the entire range of women in our data set, and we would have to constrain our sample to only women below a certain income threshold. In our data, the overlap assumption does seem to hold. So we do seem to find women with and without health insurance from all sorts of socioeconomic stratum. So again, hopefully still consistently what Peter was stressing, only after stating our identifying assumptions can we go ahead and estimate treatment effects. While so far our causal estimates were functions of these potential outcomes, these unobserved counterfactuals, or estimators will be only functions of the observed data. And the equality between what our estimators can estimate and the causal estimates will be guaranteed by the upholding of our identifying assumptions. So this is very, very important to keep in mind. So having said that, once we are at the estimators, when we are only requiring to somehow combine or observe data, we can start utilizing machine learning approaches. Many estimators of average treatment effects aim to adjust for covariates through regression and, for example, propensity score methods, sometimes combine these into doubly robust methods. And machine learning has been playing an increasing role in the construction of estimators of these treatment effects. So it seems that, again, similarly to Peter, I also have a table which very quickly summarizes the main kind of differences and similarities between machine learning for prediction and causal inference. So let's see whether we agree on this one. So one important difference between machine learning, supervised machine learning algorithms and causal inference is that in causal inference we cannot observe the so-called ground truth. So we will always need our unverifiable assumptions. So we have to work very hard on stating these assumptions and making sure that we have a convincing story for why they hold. On the other hand, causal inference approaches, especially the latest family of causal inference approaches based on semi-parametric statistical theory, inference is very well developed and uses formal tools to be able to estimate the uncertainty around our parameters and test our hypotheses. For machine learning, this is not a priority. And the third, from our perspective, perhaps most important distinction is a big advantage of the history of how machine learning has been developed, is the transparent and data adaptive way of selecting models. In causal inference, and in particular in economics, which is where my background is, model selection has been traditionally based on theory and can be rather subjective, again, potentially leading to cherry picking. So the emerging literature on causal machine learning has started combining the key strengths in these two fields. The rigor of causal inference in terms of stating assumptions, in terms of being able to do inference, and the flexibility and transparency of machine learning to select models. So how is this going to help us to solve this problem of estimating heterogeneity in treatment effects? So estimating heterogeneity in treatment effects is not the only kind of purpose of using machine learning for causal inference. One that I'm not going to use in this talk, in the application, is we could use machine learning for variable selection, for confounding adjustment, if we have high-dimensional confounders. And this variable selection is a different, has to take into account that our causal estimates are something different. Our causal estimates are what we have in mind as a target, and we don't want to interpret all those coefficients which we get as an output. The more focal point of how we're going to use machine learning in this particular application is to estimate so-called nuisance parameters. So these propensity scores and regression functions, which can give us estimators of average treatment effects, they can be, and they have been proposed to be estimated using machine learning over the last couple of decades. Mark van der Laan's work on targeted learning and the recently emerging work of Viktor Chernysakov and colleagues on double-D biased machine learning have been convincing practitioners in causal inference that it is worth using machine learning estimators for these parameters as opposed to arbitrarily defined parametric models such as logistic regressions for propensity scores and linear regressions for the outcome regressions. So this is something we are going to use in this work. And the third sort of area which I find one of the most exciting areas of machine learning merging into causal inference and serving causal inference is modifying loss functions of machine learning algorithms to actually minimize the bias in the causal parameters of interest, as opposed to minimize the root mean squared error as traditionally been used. I'm just checking the time. And the causal forest method, which I'm going to demonstrate in my remaining time, is doing exactly this. So it's just a few equations here, because I told this is statistical society and then they need to see some equations. So one way of thinking about estimating treatment effects is by postulating a partially linear model for the outcome. Then we leave a lot of it non-parametric. So fx can be any complicated function of the covariates and an additive treatment effect tau and an error term. For now, assuming that tau is homogeneous. So one smart way of trying to estimate this treatment effect without making further assumptions about the form of this fx is by creating residuals of the outcome and residuals of the treatment. For this, we do need estimates of these nuisance parameters we talked about. So we need to estimate the probability of being treated, the propensity score, given covariates, and we also need a model for the conditional expectation of the outcome given covariates. And these nuisance parameters, according to the work of Mark van der Laan and Viktor Chernysakov and colleagues, can be estimated by machine learning algorithms, can be estimated, in fact, by a wide range of data adaptive machine learning algorithms. For example, regression forests or ensembling algorithms, which can merge, which can average several predictors to minimize mean squared error.
So, Naomi, sorry to interrupt you, just to say you got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So once this is done, what we can do is to estimate a simple linear regression when we are running a regression on the residual of the outcome, on the residual of the treatment. This estimator, also referred to as the double debiased machine learning estimator, is shown to be following the nice behavior of semi-parametric estimators we like. They are consistent, asymptotically linear, and with the use of a procedure called cross-fitting, which is similar to cross-validation, it allows for the use of a wide range of machine learning algorithms. Now, so far, we assume the treatment effect tau to be homogeneous and not vary. And a quick extension to this is by assuming that now it's a function, it's an undefined, it's a non-parametric function of the covariates, the effect modifier, so it can be heterogeneous. So what we could do, we could again estimate a simple linear regression on the residuals, but only in a small neighborhood of the covariates. And as long as in the small neighborhood of covariates, the treatment effects are homogeneous, we could use the exact same estimator for estimating the treatment effect function in that very small neighborhood. The question is, how can we choose this neighborhood? How can we choose neighborhoods where inside the treatment effects are actually homogeneous, but outside of the neighborhoods, they differ from each other? And what the proposal is to use a modification of a classic machine learning approach, of the random forest approach, which has been coined quite powerfully, causal forest. So I don't think many of you need a reminder of what random forests do, but very briefly, they generate predictions of outcomes of units based on their neighboring observations when we kind of push them down on a tree. And we select the tree structure to minimize root mean squared error, prediction error in a new sample. For us, a more useful way of characterizing this is by this partition structure on the right-hand side of the slide. We can see that in this one particular tree, all the individuals around that little x are selected as neighbors, and the x's own prediction will be the average of the neighboring predictions. Random forests are simply doing this tree-based algorithm many times, and in each time we will get a somewhat different set of neighbors for this x. And in order to improve the estimation performance, we will somehow average these trees. One way of characterizing the predictor here is by a weighted average of the neighbors, where the weighting depends on how often they have been used in the trees, how often they were falling in the same partition in the trees. Now, remember, what we wanted to do is to somehow find neighborhoods where the treatment effects within the neighborhoods are similar, and outside of the neighborhoods, they are different from each other. So the causal forest algorithm modifies the splitting criteria of the random forest to maximize treatment effect heterogeneity as opposed to minimize the prediction error. And causal trees are essentially built by estimating treatment effects on partitions of the data using these small residual and residual regressions outlined before. And the splits are chosen to maximize the differences between the estimated taus as opposed to the root mean squared error of the prediction. We do this many times and we gain causal forests. We save the weights, characterizing how often an observation was used to estimate the treatment effect at the given x. And we plug in these weights and get this estimator, but now tau is actually a function of x. And this estimator will inherit the nice asymptotic properties of the original estimator. And we can base inference on resampling from the forest. And this was a very quick overview of the method, and just want to show you in the last couple of minutes what sort of results we can get. So, in terms of the average effect, surprising or not surprising, but using machine learning versus parametric method didn't make a lot of difference. Where the machine learning really starts to shine and starts to give us some. Okay, maybe I go back. Of course, this was not guaranteed. We didn't know this, so we still think that using a flexible algorithm to estimate the propensity scores and outcome regressions is a better thing to do than simply choosing something parametric, which we have done in our previous paper. Focusing on the sort of new information which machine learning can bring us here, we can first look at this table of variable importance from the causal forest algorithm. Essentially, these numbers are measuring how often these trees were split based on these variables. So they are measuring something very similar to what classic variable importance measure for prediction algorithms, except this is not for predicting the outcome, but this is predicting the treatment effect. So we find that for the subsidized health insurance program, the age of the woman was one of the most important predictors of the treatment effect, while for the contributory health insurance program, it was the socioeconomic status variables and also which province a woman lived. So going back to this idea that now we want a new little machine or an estimator which inputs the woman's characteristics and outputs the predicted individual specific gain. What do we get out of this machine? We get out this histogram. We get out a range of treatment effects where the predictions are for each woman's individual level coverage profile. Again, we should not interpret this as individual level treatment effect in a sense that it's for that particular woman, but it's for a subgroup of women who happen to have the same observed coverage profile. So still on average, just a very refined average. We can aggregate up this effect, and we can still do subgroup analysis, but we can do subgroup analysis which may not have been pre-specified. So starting with variables which we were interested in anyway, so socioeconomics, education, and rurality, we do find that those women who were vulnerable in terms of these characteristics, they benefited more from contributory health insurance. While from subsidized health insurance, this relationship was not so pronounced, somewhat disappointingly for the policymaker. We looked at subgroups which have been discovered by the algorithms. So this is where perhaps the more contentious issues come up. Can we really interpret these subgroups as something which is real? Or we use this for hypothesis generation. For example, for contributory health insurance, we find that in East Java, women benefited more from having health insurance than from the rest of Indonesia. While for subsidized health insurance, we find that those women who had their third child or higher order child benefited more than the others from health insurance. So this is maybe something up for discussion, and this is something where us researchers using these methods need to think very carefully. So what's next? Where does this leave us in terms of our theory when we discover something like this? In terms of further discussion points, well, I am still very excited about this emerging field, which links machine learning and causal inference with the explicit target of serving causal inference by using machine learning in kind of limited settings to estimate nuisance parameters or to do some sort of prediction exercises which will still get us closer to the causal target parameter. In this specific case, we took one step further from just learning the average treatment effects and use machine learning to learn something more about heterogeneity in treatment effects. a big kind of limitation and challenge and kind of criticism which we often get when we present this research is around the strong assumptions of no unobserved confounding. In particular, in social sciences, policies are often taking up a policy, for example, from an individual is often a choice, and we cannot rule out the role of unobserved variables. For example, with health insurance, private information about a woman's health can be such a variable. Luckily, there are further methodological developments which allow us to also use machine learning in settings which allow for unobserved confounding, for example, instrumental variable estimation. I think that's it from me. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors who helped us with this work. This is out as a working paper if someone wants to take a look. And very, very luckily for me, the Medical Research Council supports me on taking this work a little bit further and taking a step from characterizing the heterogeneity and treatment effect to actually trying to estimate optimal policy allocation rules. So hopefully I will be back to you with some interesting results on that in the future. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Nomi. We've got a couple of minutes. We're just going to run a little bit into the time allocated for the CSML section meeting, so we can have just a couple of questions that have come through. So Camille asks, what are the challenges you face when communicating the results from such analyses to policymakers or non-specialist audiences? In particular, how do you ensure the subtleties around methods, assumptions and limitations when it comes to interpret the results are properly understood? Well, it is tricky, and I think that's something which is a work in progress for all of us. I think the potential outcomes framework, for example, is luckily a very, very intuitive framework, and that seems to be working quite well. In terms of utilizing machine learning and kind of putting these black box tools into methods which they may have been familiar in the past. For example, inverse probability treatment weighting is already quite. It is a little bit complicated, but perhaps has been picked up by certain policymaker or technical analyst audiences. Putting machine learning into that, I think that is a challenge. And in terms of communicating, I think the point on transparency and the point on really only using these models in a limited sense to get us to our desired causal estimates of interest. I think that's something that can help us. So yeah. And that way decision makers won't be scared of the sort of problems Peter was bringing up by making decisions for people based on output from an algorithm. And I think in the optimal policy work, which we are starting to do, that will be a concern. So coming up with a decision algorithm which takes the data and gives me a covariate profile of where someone should be eligible for subsidized health insurance versus not. Yeah, so I think that would be very tricky to communicate that. Thanks, Nomi. That's just very, very quickly. There's a couple of other ones. So there's a question from Isabel Corkley. Do you get a measure of how well you have predicted for each subgroup? Does the algorithm decide how many subgroups you need, or is it that tuning parameter? And there's also the related question for Faiz, which is, did you attempt to verify the no unmeasured confounders assumption using the data? Yeah, so in this particular, thank you, these are really useful questions. In terms of the method, we actually don't need to specify subgroups at all. We specify a range of covariates which can be effect modifiers, and
it was my rather subjective choice of presenting subgroup effects for you in the end. I think that works quite nicely for visualization. I could have done other things, like I could have presented a function, for example, how the treatment effect varies as a function for continuous covariate. So that's a bit different. So that's not a subgroup, but that's another kind of projection of this conditional average treatment effect function. But the idea is that we don't need subgroups. We are trying to get an estimate of this high dimensional function and somehow kind of slice it up for our own interpretation. So that's one. And the second one about the no unmeasured confounders assumptions. There are in the causal inference literature, there are indirect tests. We could try falsification tests. We could try to look at outcomes where we should not see a treatment effect, and if we still see a treatment effect, then we can say then unfortunately or no unmeasured confounders assumption fails. But there are no ways of verifying this. So this will always be a strong assumption to make. This is why, again, my usual audiences, normally consisting of economists, they are demanding that we present an analysis which does not need this assumption. For example, uses instrumental variables to get around it.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed for that. That was a really, really interesting talk and followed on extremely nicely from Peter's, I think. So we now have, there's a break until 5 minutes past 3. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming back. So we're going to start off the second half of the workshop. The first half, we focused on the causal inference side of the workshop. And then the second half, we're going to have a look at the interpretable machine learning, interpretable AI side of things. So we've got a couple of different speakers for you. The first one's Alessandra Russo, and she's going to talk about symbolic machine learning for interpretable AI. So over to you, Alessandra.
Okay, thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I just want to start saying that, the talks in the first half, so I'm a computer scientist as a background. I can see the speakers have different backgrounds. And in particular, I've been working the last 10 to 15 years in this area of AI called machine learning. So I realized that this might be a kind of a new topic for most of the listeners. So I tried to to maintain the presentation at a very high level, but I'm very happy to answer questions, which are more technical. And really the purpose of this talk is to show and sort of like present a new angle of machine learning that maybe not many people are aware of, and which can play an important role in the aspect of interpretable AI and explainable AI. So let me just start the presentation with a quote. This is from a neuroscientist, Joshua Tenenbaum, who is kind of well known as working in the area of sort of machine learning and also looking at interpretability and transferability and other aspects of it. So his quote is that the human thought can be seen as a model building activity, and human-like learning is the process of such model building. So I like this quote very much because I share all the kind of focus of my research in the last 15 years reflect very much what this quote states. And my statement in this talk is actually symbolic machine learning has the capability of realizing this concept of human-like learning. So I hope I'm going to demonstrate you through this talk how this could be qualitatively at least measured. And first of all, we need to start thinking about what are the characteristics of human-like learning, so how humans actually do perform cognitive learning, and what characteristics are we interested to maintain when we actually do these activities. So I highlighted here 4 main characteristics, which is the ability of humans to learn from past experience and use this knowledge in order to make a prediction and generating explanations. But most importantly, which is not very much common in machine learning, at least as people think about machine learning in terms of deep learning, random forests we mentioned before, and so forth, is that the models that learn through symbolic machine learning are actually revisable and they can be extendable. And this is exactly what humans do. We learn a certain concept and then we are revising our knowledge as we are exposed to new information. We're not necessarily relearning everything from scratch each time we need to see new evidence. And also as humans, we are able to communicate what we have learned to other people. So all these four characteristics are really predominant in human activity, cognitive activity. And what I would like the message I would like you to take away from this presentation is that symbolic machine learning is capable of supporting all these different aspects. So let's try to move to, as you can see the previous talks, people had always a slide about machine learning. So inevitably, I can guarantee we haven't talked to each other. So I also have a slide about what I think are the drawbacks in particular that I would like to highlight of machine learning as in the context of deep machine learning, which is becoming more and more popular nowadays in the AI community. So we do know that these are fantastic tools for learning or extracting predictive models of unstructured data, but the software also, and sometimes they get even better than what a human can do in certain very specific tasks though. But this type of approaches have incredible drawbacks, which really needed to be addressed if we want to use AI as a pervasive mechanism in our daily life. So, and in particular, the drawbacks are that we all know they are very data intensive, so they need a large quantity of labeled data in order to learn some predictive models. And the models they learn are not really generalizable, so they often suffer about inability of predicting, so making prediction when there are distributional shifts on the data that are different from the one they've been used when they've been trained. So most importantly for this part of the workshop is that the models which are learned using deep machine learning are not really interpretable. People have been using in the talks before the word black box. So they're really black box. And I would like to state that actually symbolic machine learning is a white box. And I will show you in a minute. So, and finally, so one of the other drawbacks, which is particularly important, is that this architecture of these models cannot be, or these approaches cannot make use of any existing knowledge, any existing prior knowledge that the humans might have about a problem that they want to try to solve. So in the previous talks, there was how do we know that these kind of relations are the right one? How do we know this kind of variables are the right one? Do we have the right information? So if we have this information, how can we use this information in the training process and in learning models from data? Okay, so these are the key drawbacks, and I would like to show you during this talk that actually symbolic machine learning tends to resolve some of these drawbacks. And why? What is a symbolic machine learning? I think I will introduce a little bit this because I think this topic might be quite new for this community. So I'm in a statistician community, and I never really presented symbolic machine learning to this community. So I thought I should highlight what, at a very high level, where symbolic machine learning fits in within the big picture of AI in general in computer science. So really symbolic machine learning is at the intersection between what people call machine learning in general, which are approaches able to extract information from data, make a prediction about unseen data, and can in principle improve over time. But it's at the intersection between this area and also an area called knowledge representation, which is a big area of AI where people have been focused on mechanism and method for representing human knowledge in a human readable form. So knowledge is not necessarily variables and probability, but is also symbolic, declarative representation of concepts, relations of a concept, and so forth. So knowledge representation looks at all these aspects about how knowledge, human knowledge can be represented. And it comes up with a mechanism for making reinference from this knowledge, and we can call it predictions. And most importantly, they can be automatically verified. So here, if we represent the knowledge in kind of using this technology, we can actually check and automatically verify whether the model that we actually have represented are correct or safe or trusted with respect to whatever constraints or property humans might want to measure these models against. So symbolic machine learning is then at the intersection of the two, and essentially benefits, takes advantage of both these two areas of AI. So there are mechanisms and approaches for learning from data, and one of the important characteristics is that this system can learn from small amount of data. And this data could also be noisy, as I'm going to highlight in a minute. And they can incorporate any kind of prior knowledge which already exists. And what they learn are models that are human readable, because the kind of models which are generated by these algorithms follow the principle of this knowledge representation aspect in AI. And finally, because they are able of doing generalizations from data, the model that they are generated can be also transferred on other domains. So they don't suffer the drawback of black boxes or being overfitting the data and not generalizable. So these are specific algorithms that have the capability of generalizing and extracting models that can be applied to other particular instances of the data, even if they are slightly different from the one in which the algorithm has been trained upon. So I hope this gives a very general overview of what it is. And just to give you a very quick example, I apologize for the simplicity of the example, but I thought being a new area to your community, maybe it's better to be very common to our daily life, concepts. So what does constitute a symbolic machine learning problem? So what are the input? So we all know the black boxes take raw data. They identify features, and then we extract, models from these features and so forth. We saw the causal model before, where the variables and links between variable DAGs models and so forth. So what are really the characteristics, the input of a task which can be solved using these approaches? So first of all, this type of learning task takes any kind of existing knowledge. This might be empty. There might be no knowledge at all. We might want to start already from scratch, so from some data only. But if we already have bootstrapped some knowledge about some particular problem domain that we want to solve, then we can incorporate this knowledge into our algorithms. So, and it's got to have got this and any other supervised learning approaches, a set of positive examples and a set of negative examples. So here we have labeled examples, okay? And they might or might not have, this also can be empty, a specification or description of what is the language bias. So what are the kind of typical features, characteristics we want to our model to be defined upon. So this is, we call it a set of possible solutions or search space for our algorithms. And together with this input, the algorithms have a pretty fine notion of coverage. Now, in machine learning, you have minimizing the mean square errors with respect to predicted labels. Here, there is a more qualitative or logic-based notion of coverage, which needs to be defined, and according to what definitions you're giving, we actually can extrapolate a different framework or different mechanism for doing symbolic machine learning. So one of the typical approach definition of coverage is that over the knowledge that we have, together with the model that we have learned, have to explain. So we can read this symbol as explaining, right? Explain all the positive example, and have also to explain why the negative example are negative examples, right? So that's one, if you like, informal way of reading data. There's a more formal definitions of the symbols, which is grounded in logic, that I'm going to bypass, but I'm happy to talk about it later if there are questions. So if you look, for instance, a simple example here, suppose that we have a knowledge about family relationships, and we have examples about what concepts they actually we want to learn. So who is a daughter of who? So that these are instances, these are data, and this data can be labeled positively. So these are good instances of a certain concept. These are negative instances of a certain concept. The same concept that we want now to learn this concept. Can we actually come up with a model that defines the notion of daughter? This is a very simple example, but you can extrapolate it from that in any other domain, as I'm going to illustrate later on in some other application that we have done. So this is a kind of a search space. So these are all the concepts that appear in our knowledge base. So we have concept of parents, of female, and there can be more if you like, and the daughter and our examples. So we want to try out of this possible if you like, we call it rules. So declarative definitions of our concept data, we want to try to come up with the right optimal one. And the optimal one is in terms of definition of coverage. So it has to explain the positive instances and it does not have to cover, the negative instances. So, and then of course it's very easy. This is very trivial examples. Such algorithms are able to generate automatically models of this form where X and Y are variables. So this can be for any person. So as you can see, starting from data which are ground distances of particular people, a relationship of data of these people, we can actually extrapolate a general definition or general model that can be applied to any other domain regarding people, right? Where this concept of parent and female applies, right? So this is, you read if somebody is a parent of somebody else and somebody else is a female, then this person X is the daughter of Y, who was the parent, okay? So these kind of sort of models are very interpretable. They can easily automatically translated into language, into natural language. So you might think about, in this example, starting with a large database of concepts and extracting any kind of constraints that you might want to give at the beginning and extracting a general knowledge that defines this concept in a general sense, and that can be then used and applied to make classifications or predictions on unseen data, right? And these models, as I said, are interpretable in the sense that, so let me define what I mean by interpretable, in the sense that they can be translated in natural language and they can be communicated back to humans. All right. So typical applications of this kind of symbolic machine learning in the past have been in areas such as mutagenicity, where the task was trying to predict using structural property of molecules, try to predict which molecule had were mutagenic, because this kind of prediction is particularly important for making prediction about carcinogenesis. And so this is an example of the knowledge base. So the facts, all the information that we have from molecules that we observe in the lab. And so this kind of application, symbolic knowledge, are able to extract the general definition of a molecule when a molecule is classified to be mutagenic. And in terms of atoms that constitute the molecule structural, molecular structure property, this is a molecular structure of 5 rings, 5 edges, and bond between atoms and things like that. So as you can see, it's quite rich in terms of the type of models that can be generated. Another typical example used in the past is for learning, for instance, grammar of natural language as such. So you might think about having a sequence of strings, of sentences, and some strings might be well-formed in a grammar and not well-formed in others. So this is a positive and negative example of well-formed strings given a particular grammar, and we want to learn what this grammar is. So we might have a partial definition of some concept in this grammar, but not a full definition of the grammar that will generate all the correct strings, right? So, and if you apply this symbolic machine learning in this kind of context, where this is a typical example that means this string from 0 to 3 is actually a sentence, and this means the noun phrases, words, sentence, noun phrases, verb phrases, the typical definitions of grammatical structures. We might come up with then augmenting our grammar with new definitions that were not given a priori. So this becomes a mechanism for completing and expanding our knowledge. I don't know, natural language evolves all the time. We might have some grammatical structures that are new, or we look at grammatical structures of programming languages or something like that, and we can actually learn this grammatical structure from examples of strings. So this is actually what I call it the early applications. And the reason being, because if you see this kind of models, which are kind of rule-based, they're very simple, I would say, in their definitions. So you have the characteristics, the property, the features, we might call it, that comes from the data, and you have rules that brings together, connects the features to whatever concept we want to learn. So we call in logic this kind of representation as Horn clauses, Horn theory, but it doesn't matter. So, but there are some particular aspect of this conditions here. They are not, for instance, covered by the early systems, which is this condition cannot be negated. So I might be able to learn a rule of why from an image, a certain image is a cat if it's got a tail, if it's got whiskers, and if it's got ears and fur or whatever. But I will not be able to learn from these early systems if it doesn't have some other kind of characteristics. So concepts such as negation, default assumptions, or something are not computable by these early systems. So if you look at the landscape of this symbolic machine learning up to now, really, they were all in the expressivity of the knowledge that they were able to automatically extract from data. They were all within this level of simple program that we call it whole theory. But actually in real applications, we need much more than that. We need to talk about constraints. We need to talk about preferences. We need to talk about so non-deterministic condition, choices that humans might make, and things like that. And all these kind of concepts are not expressible at this level of these programs. So there is clearly a misconception that came up around the early, the mid 2010, where actually these systems were not really suitable for learning more complex models that capture concepts which are recursively defined. So one concept defines in terms of itself, monotonic assumptions, non-monotonic assumptions, default assumptions, preferences, and it was thought that these were too complicated for such algorithms to learn this kind of very expressive models. A second misconception you might think people before that being in a kind of logic-based, these models are actually not robust to noise. They are exact inference. And actually this was in a paper by DeepMind in a couple of years ago that was stated as a misconception, thinking that symbolic machine learning cannot deal with noise in the data. But I'm going to show you that actually we overcome completely this, and we are, the state of the art is very advanced at the moment. And further kind of misconception in these algorithms are difficult to scale on a large data set or large search spaces, right, for possible solutions. And all these kind of misconceptions are quite important, because when we learn in order to address, because when we learn the real world, in a real world problem domain, we needed to be able to deal with default assumptions, so learn concepts that use negation, so assume certain things haven't happened. And this is because our knowledge might not necessarily be complete about what happens in the environment. So we need to make those default assumptions. We needed to be able to learn the constraints. So for instance, we need to know what should never be the case. So this is the case, a typical example of a Sudoku. These are the typical constraints that govern the rules for Sudoku boards. And such conditions should never be satisfied. So falsity should never occur in our models. So this is a way of constraining the learning process. And finally, we want to be able to learn preferences. So you might imagine a human, system that learns preferences and decisions that humans have when they make certain decisions. And these preference models in our system are represented formally like that. Don't worry about the symbolic notation here. I will not have time enough to say what this means, but you can automatically translate this representation into something of this form. So some English sentences that communicate to the human what the system thinks the human preferences are when the human has made a certain kind of decisions. And we wanted to be able to use, learn models that has got all these characteristics. So we want to increase the expressivity of our models. And that's exactly what we have done in my group, actually in Imperial, in the last, 15 years, I would say, and more. And in particular, we have developed a family of systems which are now scalable and equally expressible. So I'm going to just give you an overview of some of the application of these systems of where we have used and why they can be useful in the context of interpretability and interpretable AI, right? So these exactly are the family which are non-monotonic. They allow these default assumptions. These are the family of systems that support learning models which have constraints, preferences, robust to noise, and so forth, all the things I've spoken so far. Okay, so this is a simple example that we did in 2011, and in the back here, the slides, you will see all the papers where this work has been published. And the idea is to learn policies that govern the devices automatically, so they allow the devices to self-adapt. All right, and we want to learn these policies as the human is using these devices by observing the decisions of the human and the contextual information in which the human is making these decisions when is using the particular devices. So here was a simple example of learning the policy that the human has in their head when they answer certain phone call, given the context in which the human find themselves. So you might think about learning, in this case, models where defines the concept of when a person is answering a call or not, depending on a number of conditions. This can be positive or negative. And there are many variables here, as you can see, right? So there are around 5,000 possible choices if you think about all the settings and all of the time constraints in which a person might be in the day and other things like that, okay? And so the space is very big. We are talking about 10 to the power 147 approximately rules that can be constructed using all these different features. And we were actually able to develop system, this is called ASPAL, which is a very initial system, that was able to learn rules that kind of communicate back to the human what the system thinks are the conditions upon which the human accepts or not the phone calls. And by communicating that in English, the human has the ability to give feedback back to the system and say, oh, this particular condition is important, this is actually true, and accept or reject whatever the system is actually suggesting, so that the system can take the feedback and continuous learning and improve the model that builds upon human behavior, okay? So we wanted then to make this a little bit more expressive in our applications. So I'm going to give you now a very brief overview of our language for expressing our models, because I realize that this might be new to all the community. And the kind of system that we have now currently are called ILASP system. This is inductive learning of answer programs. And answer programming is a language for declaratively expressing the environment in which the human behave and performing reasoning in a logical manner. So the idea, you might think you have a real world problem. This real world gets encoded normally manually in these programs. This program can be solved, so it generates some solutions, and from these solutions that the program generates correspond to solutions of the real problem to start with. This is if we are going to engineer these kind of models. But what we actually do at the moment is learning those models. And how do we learn? We use this paradigm in the other way around here, really. We start not from manual encoding of the model, but just from examples of real solutions. So given these examples of real solutions, can we actually encode this example somehow into our system and learn a model in this language that can correspond then to the real world problem, the modeling of the real world problem to start with. So then we are going to have a program here, a model that can be used in other similar instances of this real world problem and solve and make predictions. So characteristics of this language is that you can capture default and exceptions through a concept called the negationist failure. You can capture non-determinism choices through some other construct, and you can capture preferences through these weak constraints I was referring in the previous slides. So let's see how we made now this application of learning human preferences a little bit more elaborated and embedded into this continuous learning that the system is able to perform because it works in tandem with humans, really. So this is an application domain that we did in urban mobility, where again, the objective here was not to learn the policy for answering calls or not, but rather learning the preferences of human in choosing a certain journey in a particular city. So let's imagine that the system has already got some preference model or might not have anything. This is what I called before prior background knowledge. And now we are, based on this model, the human is providing suggestions of possible journey to in going from point A to B, if you like. Now, these are suggestions that, according to the model that the system has about the human preference, are all equally preferable, really, in a sense. And by observing the choice that the human is making, so what kind of journey the human is preferring here out of all these four possibilities, the system can also automatically generate the counterexamples for its own model. Because if thought initially these are equally preferable and now the human is making a choice, is implicitly stating that the human is preferring A to all the other options, and that could be taken as. So therefore, we could use this choice that the human makes as an automatic generations of examples for the learner. And the learner, you use this example to now learn a more refined model of the human preference and changing these preferences, and then over time to provide better and more targeted suggestions to humans. Now, if you want to think about what is the accuracy, how do we measure that actually what we're learning is actually right? We did this in a kind of simulated environment, I have to admit. So we generated, we considered a target, the preference model that we wanted to learn. We generated many examples of a possible journey. And the interesting thing is that our system was able to, let's consider now the blue line here, where actually the counterexample is not just strictly prefer, but prefer or equal. So we were able to reach 80% just with 8 only counterexamples. So in terms of the accuracy of the predicted model versus what is the oracle, the target model that we wanted to learn. And of course, over 40 of these examples, we reached over 90%. So this is a very promising area in which when we don't have lots of data available and we wanted to have models that can learn from this few data, we can actually perform this kind of learning and report back to human what the model has actually learned in natural language. So that is one of the standpoint of the system. But okay, but then you might think about this counterexample not to be absolute. So human might have different preferences depending on different contextual situation in which they find themselves. So we introduce a concept in our work of context-based label examples. So a label example comes with a particular context. So a human might prefer a certain journey if it's in the context that maybe it's not raining outside, or prefer another journey if it is raining. Now here the context, the kind of work is contextualized, examples are contextualized, and can we actually take into account this context to learn models from in the same ways I described before, that describe preferences of humans. And of course, you can see here that we have a family of systems that we are able to maintain also the computational time of even 500 examples, so increase scaling up over the number of examples in which this model is applied, without necessarily exponentially growing on the computational time that these models actually require. So we thought that it was an interesting breakthrough that symbolic machine learning can provide. And finally, the other point I said before is noise. What about if actually the human is thinking they prefer a certain journey, but actually it's not? So, it made the wrong choice. So how can we take that into account? So we consider that in what we call it a mislabeled examples. So the choice, the counterexample that were generated based on the choice of the human, some of that were actually mislabeled, were not the real counterexamples. Okay, so they are still contextualized. So can we actually still learn these interpretable models, even if our examples are mislabeled, so they don't have the right labels? And we actually made some experiment to evaluate that, and we can actually demonstrate that even with increasing the level of noise in our label examples, we can reach 20% of examples will be noisy, if you like, or mislabeled, which is the blue line. You can reach 90% of accuracy over 100 examples. Of course, more noise you have, more examples you need to reach the high level of accuracy. This is a typical trade-off in all of machine learning, really. But it's quite promising to see that the robustness of these systems, so that even though they're logic-based, they can handle this level of noise in the data, okay, when learning these models. Okay, now just to give you another example of how complex these models can be, this is a typical example of learning a mathematical definition here, right? So here we want to learn the concept of Hamiltonian graphs. These are graphs. A graph is Hamiltonian if you can traverse every single node exactly once. All right. So this is an example of Hamiltonian, non-Hamiltonian graphs. And all we know here is that we have a set of graphs of up to 4 nodes, right? This is what is represented here, right? And some labeled graphs, okay? Can we learn a general knowledge of Hamiltonian graph that we can apply later to any size graph without having to retrain our algorithm if now we increase the number of nodes in our graph? And in fact, this is actually doable. This is a very complicated program that if I want to translate in English automatically, I can. And I can say the graph is Hamiltonian if the cycle is a subset of any part of my current graph, and has to be, all nodes have to be reachable. This is all this definition of reachability here. And every node must be reachable, so I must leave any node outside and not reachable. And they must be reached exactly once, and this is expressed by this particular constraint. So I can have a way of taking this model and writing back in English and making this model interpretable to human to see whether it is correct or wrong. And the important bit is we learn a very general definition here by only considering graphs of 4 nodes, and we can apply this to any large graph as we want without having to retrain our algorithms. So here are just some statistics, again, of noise on how many of these graphs we need to reach closer to 100% of accuracy, and what is the runtime. Here is a much harder problem, so the computational time is a little bit higher than what I showed before. Okay, so I can see that I'm running out a little bit of time, so I have a couple of other examples here to show, but I want maybe to skip those on grammar, and I want to take you, if you don't mind, I want to take you to some some of the new area that we have now continued to explore. So out of these examples that I'm skipping, this is the lesson to take that we have been able to resolve 2 of these misconceptions. And therefore, one big problem is the scalability. How can we deal with large search space where this program can be very complicated? So we developed recently, this is published in AAAI 2020, this is in this year, a new version of the system which is much more scalable, and we applied it to video, the sort of image data set that were already annotated, and we were able to deal with a much larger search space and increasing the F1 score predictions of our models with respect to state-of-the-art systems. So again, we are pushing on the scalability of the search space here of possible solutions. So the general question I want to go to conclude just my talk is, what about if our data are actually unstructured? So I talked about logic and label data, and they all seem to be structured, but what about if they are unstructured? What about if I have images which are not labels? Can I still learn this kind of models? We've done some examples of natural language text, and we've shown how we can combine a neural network for parsing natural language together with some other mechanism, which is called a combinatory categorical grammar, in order to then learn abstract common sense knowledge and solve question answering on the natural language text. And again, comparing with standard machine learning, we are able to get very close to 100% with very few examples, where all these other methods require over thousands of examples in order to solve the same task. So the next step, the open challenge here, and therefore, how can we deal even more with the non-structured data? And this is the area where we're actually working very much actively in our group, but also in general in many machine learning community and industries such as DeepMind, Facebook, and Google's and so forth. And it is what is really the opportunity for combining or integrating different strands of machine learning, the symbolic machine learning, which is very good for learning abstract concept, interpretable, expressible in natural language, together with deep learning algorithms that can actually extract features very effectively from large unstructured data. So is there a way of integrating this in a sound manner? All right, so that's a completely open challenge in AI and machine learning at the moment. And we have tackled very recently the one directions of that, so which is the forward propagation, if you like, of such an architecture that basically consists of developing an approach that takes images which are really unstructured here, and labels which are define whether certain, for instance, a Sudoku board, a valid board or not valid board. And we're going to have a neural network trained to predict the digits, and the prediction of the digit neural network is fed into our symbolic learner, and the symbolic learner was able to deal with noise, can actually learn, extract from this data, which is a Sudoku board with labels, what are the general constraints that can predict these labels on any other Sudoku board, unseen Sudoku board. So we did a contribution of how we can do the integration. There's a forward training path, and the results are quite promising. So as you can see, this is where we are in our architecture, which is now a forward propagation architecture hybrid between machine deep learning and symbolic learning, versus other methods. So the green one, for instance, is the random forest approach that was also mentioned before, and the other ones are the standard deep learning CNN, LSTM method for doing a prediction. So we are clearly much more robust if the prediction of a valid board is done symbolically, which is a much more sound approach than pure pattern matching, if you like. And we also measure the interpretability. So we took all these models here, which are more deep learning, and we use the surrogate approaches for computing decision tree that approximate the predictions of this CNN, black box approaches. And you can see that if we measure the interpretability in terms of the number of concepts that are present in the model, our model that is equally much more accurate has got a very limited number of concepts, whereas all the concepts extracted from the decision tree and the random forest have a huge number of concepts. So if we're going to interpret data from a human point of view, these are clearly much harder to interpret than these models that we can learn with our symbolic and machine learning approaches. So in summary, I would like just to conclude by giving you this message. The symbolic and machine learning is actually capable at the current state of the art of learning very complex models, generalizing from noise data, making this model interpretable to human by just translating them in English, and also reasoning upon this model to generate explanations. If human ask a question, why, and in what case, the circumstances, and so forth. And they can also be now started, we are moving towards that, integrated this technology and approaches where the more black box systems, they are very effective from working on raw data. So what we needed to do next is how to have a more quantitative measure of the uncertainty of the models that the prediction that our models can make. So because clearly the goodness of the accuracy is based on the data, but given the data, so how uncertain or certain is the prediction? So we are working on these directions here. And then completing all this idea of hybrid models, neurosymbolic, in a kind of end-to-end fashion, not just forward pass. So hopefully this will be the new breakthrough in AI that we're going to make. So I would like to acknowledge some of my collaborators, in particular in the work which are presented in this talk, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Alessandra. That was really a lot of information that you managed to get into the 40 minutes there. So thanks very much for that. That was great. I imagine that I didn't sort of stop you there at the time just because we didn't have questions coming through on the chat. I'm guessing just because you explained a lot of things very well, and it was, like you say, a new topic for I think a lot of people at this meeting. I did have a quick question myself before we take a very quick break, which was the link that I sort of see here with the causal modeling described earlier is that presumably you can specify a causally structured model as a symbolic model. And so I wonder if you've thought about or explored sort of the possibilities of using the symbolic learning approaches that you've got to learn causally structured models.
That's a very good question, and really I can see great potential here, because the problem is a lot of these area in AI are kind of separate, but actually they are very much related. And in fact, so causality is one of the things that we learned when we did the caveat data set that we want to predict people meeting or not meeting from feature extracted from images, right? We predicted the rules about initiating, what are the conditions that would initiate, that would cause two people to meet or not cause two people to meet. So there can be clearly a relationship between the algorithm that we're using for learning our models as a mechanism for learning causal models. So another typical example, for instance, is in the preference models. There are mechanisms called a conditional preference network, or CPNet, that people are using to learning the preference models. And again, these are similar to DAG models, so to a certain extent. And we can actually learn these models automatically. So although we haven't directly applied to the problem of learning DAGs, as we were talking this morning, I can see great potential because of the specificity of the language is very much related to that. What might need to be done is increasing the way extending the approaches with probability, right? So combining the rule learning with probabilistic inference, and we would have the entire package at the end, which is one of the things that we're working on at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. We have had a few questions come in at the end there, but what I might do is just leave them to after Vera's talk. If we all have a break for a couple of minutes, and then maybe come back at sort of 7 minutes to the hour. This is the final talk of the workshop. So Vera is one of my colleagues at IBM Research, who focuses on the sort of human aspects of AI. So she's going to talk to us about questioning the AI towards human-centered interpretable machine learning. So over to you, Vera.
Cool, thanks for the introduction and thanks for being here. So I want to share some work that we have been doing in the past 3 years on the topic of human-centered XAI. But before I dive into the topic, I want to just see a few things that situate the kind of work we do. I think I'm a bit of an outlier among the speakers. So I'm a human-computer interaction researcher. I'm trained in both computer science and behavioral science. My interest is usually around understanding how people interact with technology so that we can improve the design of technology. We're also a small HCI group in a large AI research organization. Most of my colleagues working on developing new AI algorithms. So over the time, we see us playing this kind of bridging role between taking what's produced by the academic community and making them more accessible to our product team. So this interpretive machine learning XAI work, the kind of overarching motivation is that on one side, this is a fast-growing field. On the other side, we have a lot of AI product team. They recognize the importance of having explainable, transparent AI products. They're very eager to take up the idea from the research community, not just in an analytical sense, but also making them as an explanation feature for the end users. But they may not know where to start. So a lot of our work kind of center around answering the question, if you're designing AI products, which explanation technique to use and how to design this user experience. Meanwhile, we also want to bring back the kind of insights we have from studying real-world user communities, for example, inform where are the gaps for algorithm work. I also want to just talk about terminology and get it out of the way. I know we've been talking about interpretable machine learning. In my slides, you'll mostly see explainable AI or XAI. I think Peter touched on some of the difference that explainability is usually considered a little bit broader, have more of a proactive character. But in our work, we mostly use them interchangeably. AI is not just machine learning, but I would say our current work mostly still focused on explaining machine learning models. The reason I use explainable AI is they are more commonly used by practitioners, and I work closer to them. Also, my focus is often focusing on explanation is known as a system output or system feature, rather than making the underlying model interpretable. There's also kind of a scope difference. I think the machine learning community tends to focus strongly on understanding the model's decision process, but I think when you talk to practitioners, term is used more broadly. So anything that makes AI more understandable is fair game. For example, also explaining data, explaining output, explaining performance. So as HCI researcher, I think our work is kind of these two threads. One is what I call research into design. We study the current design practices around explainable AI. Where are the challenges? Another is what we call research through design and case studies. We try to identify important AI use cases we believe explanation will make a difference. And we take that, we build prototype, we run a human subject experiment, trying to rigorously evaluate the effectiveness of different kinds of explanation. So today I'm gonna pick one study from each thread, but I will start with a very brief kind of motivation for this human-centered XAI. So without saying too much, of course, AI is increasingly used in many domains for high-stakes tasks. Accompanying this trend is also a quest for explainable AI, that is to make the AI system more understandable by people so that people can feel more confident, more comfortable using AI's recommendation and when necessary, access its caution. Also, explanation is also such a basic part of our human instinct. When we see something new, something we don't understand, we want to seek explanation. But this is a challenging field for practitioner. It's highly technical. So this is a somewhat early, somewhat old image. There's also, of course, a topic for debate. And I think what Alessandra just discussed is actually a path forward to resolve this dilemma. But there is a general consensus that if we just consider the common machine learning model used, there's a trade-off between performance and explainability. The commonly considered as a high-performing model, for example, deep neural networks, where those used in ensemble, they tend to be complex, opaque, and not directly interpretable. So often you have to have another set of algorithm or technique to make them explainable. Just one example, you might have heard the algorithm line, which is one of probably the most popular explainability algorithm. What it does is produce locally faithful explanation for any kind of machine learning model. For example, taking a deep neural network machine learning model and you want to explain a particular prediction, right? What Lime does is just look at input and output, treating it as a black box, and also sample its neighboring instance and build an interpreted model, for example, a regression, and use that simple model to explain the complex model. So this is also called post hoc techniques or surrogate model. And the kind of form of explanation is what we call feature contribution or feature importance, basically highlighting for this instance and making this prediction because certain feature. And in image, features means usually superpixel or patches of the image. So that's just one example, right? A lot of this kind of algorithm or technique being produced, I would say at scale of hundreds, if not more algorithms. And these are just some recent review paper on this. And another noticeable trend is also very recently, there is a growing number of toolkits that make this kind of XAI technique produced by the research community accessible for practitioner, whether as code libraries or tools. What we IBM research, AI explainability 360. I will not talk too much, but here's a link. You're more than welcome to check it out. So with this kind of toolkits, it is likely that explainability feature will become more and more used by product team and become part of AI system. But XAI is also hard because explanations are consumed by people. the effectiveness and explanatory power depend on the recipient, the consumer. Just by making a model transparent does not necessarily guarantee that this is understandable or useful by the users, right? So GDPR require that you provide meaningful information about the logic, but how do we unpack the word meaningful? That really has to depend on whether the recipient can interpret the meaning. Also, even just for the same system, there are different kinds of explanation consumer, right? There are developers, there are regulatory bodies, there are end users, there are people getting expected. They also may have both different aspects of model they want to understand, and also they may have different preference in terms of explanation. So going back to the core question, one answer, which explanation technique to use, and how do I design this experience? So this really ideally should follow the kind of user-centered approach. And in practices, this often falls on either designers or user experience researcher in a product team whose job involves, on the one side, they try to understand what a user needs, and then they work with data scientists, developer, trying to identify the right technical solution. So that motivated us to do a project last year that we look into the design practices across many AI product teams within IBM. We try to understand what's the current practice, where are the challenges. Our ultimate goal is trying to develop methods to support creating this human-centered XAI products. Meanwhile, we also want to understand using this as an opportunity to understand this real-world user needs for explainability. So we want to talk to designer about the topic, but very quickly we run into this problem, right? How do we talk about a technical space people are not quite in there yet? Designer might not be familiar with these different kinds of algorithm. There may not be a shared language or framework to talk about it. So how do we talk about it? So we created a study probe, which is HCI term, which really means a kind of a concrete representation of information to ground our discussion. So we created a list of algorithm-informed XAI questions. It's based on the following assumption. The most important assumption is people's needs for explanation can be represented by prototypical question they ask. For example, how the model works, why this particular recommendation, what if I change my instance? This is both based on prior work on explaining computing system, not in machine learning domain, and also this fundamental definition that explanation is an answer to a question. So explanation depends on what question is being asked. And then we assume also a prototypical question can be answered by one or multiple XAI methods, which can be implemented by one or multiple XAI algorithms. So the gist here is that even though we may have hundreds of algorithms, a lot of them produce similar form of output we call method. So if we stay at the granularity of method, it's much more tractable. So just give you an example, right? So a very common question is the why question. Why is this image classified this? Why give you this prediction? As I just mentioned, this kind of question can be answered by local feature contribution, which is what we call XAI method. It can be implemented by line. It can also be implemented by many other algorithms, which may differ in certain computational characteristics, which in my research we ignore, say agnostic at this moment. So with that, we started with kind of large literature review. We try to arrive at a list of explanation methods, and then we map them to prototypical question people may ask. For example, the local feature importance answers the why question, and kind of global feature importance answering how question. And we also refer to space and 3 more descriptive category, including explaining data, explaining output, and explaining performance. So in total, we created these 9 different categories of question, and then we create this question card. So for each category, we have a leading question, we have some common variation, and then we brought those questions to our designers. So we interviewed 20 designer, UX researcher across 16 different AI products. What we did is we asked them to first walk us through the AI system you work on. Then more bottom up, what are some common questions you saw your user ask for understanding the AI? Then we'll walk through each card and discuss, do you see that kind of question? Do they apply? Did we miss anything? We'll also end the discussion with some general challenges they see as to create explainable AI system. So the middle two step, essentially what we did is we try to collect a list of common questions users ask about to understand AI. And then we did some content analysis. So one of the contribution of the work is we produce this XAI question bank, which are common questions people ask for understanding AI system across different kinds of AI system. It's quote designer sourced. We organize them also in this kind of hierarchical structure with this 9 different categories. So I'll come back to talk about how we may use this question bank. I want to first talk about what are some observations we have from the study, why it's challenging to design explainable AI user experience. The first challenge I observe is that there are a huge variability of XAI needs. People may want to understand different aspects of AI for different product, for different interaction, or different user group. In other words, they may ask different kinds of questions. One of the main reasons is that people seek explanation for very different end goals. I want to give you 2 examples. So a lot of the system we study is in the realm of AI-assisted decision-making or AI decision support. So a very common end goal people have for understanding the AI's recommendation is they want to gain further insights so they can act on AI's recommendation. For example, this is a tool, it's a supply chain management support that AI will give people a recommendation that certain delivery might be delayed. And the user will want to understand reason because that will determine their follow-up action, right? Whether it's because whether I cannot do anything about it or somewhere I can make a quick phone call. So in that kind of, with that kind of end goal, the common question they ask, one is the why question, why this particular recommendation, and how to be that? How can I reduce this predicted delay? And a different end goal, which is also very common, is to have explanation to evaluate AI's capability, especially common for new users or regulatory body, business owner. Here, their question is, one is the performance question. How well does it perform, where it may fail? And also a how question. People are interested from a high level, how the model works, what kind of rule, what kind of rationale it follow, to evaluate whether align with their domain knowledge. So that's just 2 examples. In the paper, we summarized a list of 5 kind of main end goal we see in our study. We also mentioned that there are other kinds of factors like the user group, usage point, can also vary the kind of question people ask. And the second design challenge is, at least currently, there are gaps between algorithmic output and human explanation. Explainable AI design is a very interesting space to work in because users tend to have very high expectation because we're so familiar with explanation and we have expectation. What are some criteria or property that makes a good explanation? But a lot of them are currently not well supported by the current algorithm. I'll just give you some example. Human explanation are selective. We're not going to expose everything about our rationale. We will try to pick the most informative, the most persuasive. But this again is a very well algorithm. And also human explanation is part of a social process, is interactive. We tailored that to our recipients. So again, that's not very well supported by the current algorithm. The last part is we highlight there are some challenges, process-oriented challenge that explain kind of even though we keep talking about explainable AI, why in current AI system, we're still not seeing explanation as a very common feature. So for the product team, it's very costly to invest or prioritize explanation feature because first, they have challenge navigating the technical space. Designers are often not trained in machine learning. They also have a difficult time keep up with what's being produced out there. And another part is also designing explanation feature requires this collaboration between designers and data scientists. And then there's certain communication barrier. So those kind of challenges make it very costly. And some of our interviewees use the term, this is still a in the dark design process. So a lot of our work kind of focus on how do we produce either guideline or method that make this streamline this design process and help people reason about if I have an application, how should I design this explanation feature? So the first thing we propose is to use the XAI question bank. What we have here is just a starting point. You can imagine that we can keep expanding this as a bank. What it essentially is a checklist that representing this whole space of user needs for explanation. And your goal is to use it and figure out for my application, for this particular interaction, what question my user might ask and which one I should prioritize. So in the paper, this question bank also served two other functions. I will not delve into it, but I want to point to the paper. One is that we kind of use them to ground our discussion, trying to understand in real world scenario why this question is being asked. So we derive some high level design guideline, how we should address those questions from users. We also use it to perform a gap analysis. So here you want to pay attention to the question with the asterisk. So these are the questions that appeared in an interview, but was not in our initial version of this algorithm-informed list. So they point out some areas that users tend to ask, but we may not have widely used algorithm to answer it. Just give you one example, users are very interested about the potential change because they understand that AI system will keep learning. So they are interested in how the system might change. How can I change the system? There's that kind of question may not be well supported at this moment. So in the paper, again, we point to some future direction that the technical AI or algorithmic work can focus on. So coming back to this design process, when I say design process, it's not just you can use it if you're a designer, but whenever you have an AI application, you want design explanation feature for your end user, you can follow this process. We call it question-driven XAI design process, which we propose to ground the whole process, understanding what's the needs of the user, what aspects they want explanation, identifying potential solution or a technical or design solution, and also evaluating the solution so you can iteratively improve the design, all grounded in the question that's being asked. So in the first step, your goal is really trying to identify the question your user might ask, whether use this question bank or asking your real user. And you also want to understand why these questions are being asked. So with that, you can identify your user requirements to address those questions. Then you can work with data scientists, if you're a designer, to identify potential technique that can answer those questions. And then you evaluate with the requirement, iteratively design and fill the gaps. So the question bank can support this kind of question elicitation process, and the mapping we did in the beginning from algorithm methods to question type can be used to support this mapping between question and candidate method to answer it. So to summarize, in this work, we studied design practices. We identified 9 categories of user needs for AI explainability. We propose guidelines to address them and also use that to kind of guide opportunity for future technical work. We also produce a concrete design tool. One is this XAI question bank, and also this XAI design process. And a lot of current work are trying to put all this into practices, working with design team within IBM, and also put those design guidelines into more consumable format for practitioners, for designers. So that is the first part of my talk. I want to move to the second part. As we mentioned, another line of our research is to identify important use case and run case study. Today, I want to pick one use case is fair machine learning. How can we design explanation to support the process of building fairer machine learning models? So I also want to mention that this work is led by a former intern, Jonathan Dodge, who is currently a PhD student at Oregon State University. So I will not dive into this whole fair ML topic. There are a lot of work going on in the machine learning community, in HCI community, in FA community. But the very high level is just that, of course, machine learning learn pattern from data, and disparity is a given. But when this disparity puts certain unprivileged group in a systematic disadvantage, that should be considered unfair, biased, and even illegal in some contexts. So, of course, recently there is an explosive amount of work looking at how to make machine learning model fairer. A lot of work focused on statistical technique to de-bias the model. But the community has largely recognized that an automated approach is not the way to go. The reason is there are many different definitions of fairness, and which definition to adopt depends on the particular context, depending on the impacted group. So you kind of have to have human in the loop to scrutinize the model and identify there is a fairness problem, what fairness problem, and what is the right intervention. So our work is to support this human in the loop. We intend to use explanation as an interface to help people scrutinize the model and identify there is a fairness problem. When I say people, there are really different groups as well, right? So developer may want to improve the model, regulator needs to audit the model, and also impacted group, they want to make sure they're not being treated unfairly. And we also define this end goal for explainable AI in this use case is fairness calibration, not enhancement, but calibration, meaning that if the model is biased, a good explanation should help people identify the bias. If the model is unbiased, a good explanation should help foster trust and confidence. So with that kind of defining this problem space, we choose to do a case study. We want to explain Compass. So Compass is a software that's used by the legal system, at least in the United States, to support judges make, for example, bail decision. What it essentially does is to give a recidivism risk prediction, telling you this particular defendant may have a high or low risk of reoffending. So Compass published the data set, not the underlying model. This data set is widely recognized as unfair bias because the historical reason there's racial biases. So we just take that data and we train a simple model, train a regression model. So you should consider that model to be an unfair model. And because we're interested in the calibration problem, we need to create a ground truth, which is a fairer model. So we used a state-of-the-art technique to do debiasing, to debias the racial bias in the data, also including the correlated features. And we created another version of model by different metrics. It should be considered as a statistical fairer model. So we take this two model, we created a system that basically replicated what Compass does, right? Give a defendant, I give you a prediction. It also generates explanation. I will work them. The first one is what we call sensitivity explanation, also called contrastive explanation. It focuses on if I perturb a certain feature, it will change my prediction. So that gave user an idea what is the most critical feature for this decision. And then we have case-based explanation. It does not get into the actual rationale, but kind of justify the decision, saying there are similar cases and they had a similar outcome. Then we have input influence. Some people call global feature importance, which talk about how the model weighs different feature. Then we have demographic explanation, which focus on these patterns in the data. What I want to point out is there is a distinguish that the upper two kinds of explanation is what we call local explanation. They focus on explaining this particular prediction, and then they will change when you ask about different instances. The bottom two is what we call global explanation. They give you a high-level view how the model makes prediction. They will not change when you ask about different cases. And from a question point of view, the top two, local explanation, typically answer the why question, and the global explanation typically answers the how question. So we want to run a controlled experiment. We want to test with these 4 different style of explanation, what are their effectiveness for fairness calibration. We also focus on particular definition of fairness, which is individual fairness, which states that similar individuals should receive similar treatment. Our hypothesis is that local explanation, because they focus on this individual decision rationale, they will help people to identify individual fairness problem. And we're also interested in this kind of baseline fairness perception, whether certain explanation is perceived as inherently less fair. So we conducted a mechanical Turk experiment. The experiment is quite straightforward. We have these 8 different conditions: a fair model, a less fair model, 4 different kinds of explanation. So in total, 8 conditions. We assign participants to one of the 8 conditions. We show them 6 instances, and then we ask them to rate, do you think this prediction was fair? So I want to just walk you through some of the most interesting patterns. I will not get into the statistical detail here. So here what I plot is this fairness rating across different experimental group. The first question we ask is fairness calibration. Here you want to pay attention to the one with the circle, which is the raw model, the less fair model, and the one with the triangle, which is the processed fairer model. And you can see across the board, people give higher rating to the processed model, meaning that with both 4 kinds of explanation, they will have this calibration effect that people are able to recognize the raw model is less fair and give it a lower fairness rating. And then we are interested in this hypothesis whether local explanation, case and specific explanation, can help people identify individual fairness issue. So what I forgot to mention is we also particularly sampled instances that's around the decision boundaries. So by definition, when you have an unfair model, you are likely to see some individual fairness problem in those instances sampled on the decision boundary. So here you want to pay attention to the blue and the red line. So the blue line are the sampled group around the decision boundary. And as we hypothesized, indeed, people gave a lower rating to the impacted the group have individual fairness problem only for the 2 local explanation. So it will become more evident if I actually show you the kind of explanation, how they actually look like. So for example, for this defendant, right, the sensitivity explanation is basically saying, if you perturb the risk bit, I will give you a different explanation. So that is exactly the definition of the individual unfairness. So that alert people to identify, okay, this unfair model have this individual unfairness problem. And the case explanation is kind of a different mechanism, which talks about, yes, there are similar, it's ambivalent disease, 60% of them had a similar outcome. It's also interesting is this kind of baseline fairness. People generally consider case-based explanation itself, talking about how many similar people had a similar outcome to suffer from fairness problem itself. So that point out explanation style will mediate people's fairness judgment, right? With the same model, when you give people different explanation, they may give it different rating because there's certain way the explanation is considered unfair. What's also interesting is this kind of baseline fairness perception depend on some individual factors. In the paper, we have more detail. We just want to give you one example. So in the study, we asked people to report their general attitude, whether they think it's fair to use machine learning model for this context. For those generally consider ML is fair to use, they also prefer seeing global explanation, meaning that when you have that global explanation presented, they also perceive the whole model as even fairer. So that points to this interesting question of individual differences, and then whether you want to accommodate this individual difference or offset individual difference, again, depending on your context, and also whether you are adopting a more normative versus descriptive definition of fairness. So I'm running out of time, so I will very quickly summarize here. So this is a case study. We look at different explanation method to support model scrutinization using fairness as a use case. One of our kind of goal is to show there's no one fits-all solution, and which method to choose depend on the type of fairness problem you're looking at, some of the individual differences you consider, and also what aspect of scrutinization people want to focus on. And one thing I really want to hammer it in a lot of that work is this importance of articulating your end goal of explanation. For example, we need to first articulate the goal is collaboration, and that should guide your design and also evaluation of explanation. So we need to create that ground truth of different kinds of models. And that also kind of leads to my concluding remarks here. I think a common criticism that HCI or social science community for the ML community is that algorithm is often developed in a vacuum. There is not a clear understanding what kind of context they work, what context they don't. But I also think it's not enough to pat on someone's shoulder saying, oh, you need to understand user, you understand context. The question is, how do we make it actionable, especially for practitioner to figure out what kind of explanation they should use? So one thing is to have this kind of concrete guidelines, step-by-step method people can follow. And another aspect in our work is how do we have actionable framework or the right level of abstraction to characterize different contexts which may vary the explanation people need. In our work, we consider two lines of variable. One is the end goal of users. Another is what are some user character that may vary what kind of explanation they need. We focus on, for example, this AI attitude, the knowledge, the domain knowledge, and quality style. So this user goal and user character will vary both what aspects of explanation, what aspects of AI they want to understand, and also their evaluation criteria. Both of them will determine how should we develop explanation, how should we design this user experience. So with that, I'd like to conclude my talk. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank my collaborators. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Vera. So I think that was a very nice talk to end on because it brings a bit of a different perspective from some of the other talks and sort of reminded us that as good as we can make either AI models or machine learning models or conventional statistical models or causal models, the communication aspect of them is incredibly important if we want to have a positive effect downstream from after we built the model. So that was really nice. So we've got a question from Ben Powell. The question is, do you think incoming XAI legislation is necessary? Aeronautical engineers are not obliged to explain jet engineer design to air passengers. They might provide simple analogies that are partially reassuring, but arguably they only mollify users rather than informing them.
So I'm not sure if it's just me that it seems to breaking a little bit. I just caught the first part of the question is about the legislative body.
Sorry, yeah. I don't know if you can see the chat. It's just the final question in the chat. So it's about whether incoming XAI legislation is necessary, with an analogy to explanations from in aeronautical engineering, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I don't know enough to comment on the legislation part of the topic, but I definitely think auditing is always beneficial, and especially given this field of the choice of different explanation and what kind of explanation you are choosing. So again, explanation should be the safeguard, right? You should have the right explanation to guarantee that people's understanding about the model is correct, right? So having that kind of supervision or having that kind of regulation is important, knowing what explanation you should choose for different kinds of contexts. And again, also, explanation itself has many different evaluation criteria. There's a recent nice paper I pointed out to. It's called Explainability Fact Sheets, published at this before called FACT-STAR conference, now called FACT conference, that kind of enumerate just for explanation itself, there are many, many different criteria that they need to satisfy. And again, that also requires having certain auditory body to make sure those are satisfied. Thanks for the question.
Excellent, thank you. Oh, we've got another one coming. Oh, you can see them there now. So do you think that XAI frameworks are often biased towards most hot data manifolds like images or text? Do you see these types of frameworks being useful for more scientific applications, such as, say, protein design or predictive network models?
Do you see this type of framework? If I understand correctly, this is a question about modality, right? I think so. One thing when we talk about explanation methods, we kind of intentionally stay agnostic to the modality. In my view, is whether we're using an image highlighting certain superpixel, or are we using text to describe what is the important feature. There is a commonality in the shared mechanism. So at least when I reason about the design space, I intentionally decouple this mechanism or method and the modality. There are recent work studying how the modality changed the perception. I would say that's another point of the decision point for the design as well. There's certain heuristic, right? For example, the image kind or visualization usually works better for people who are well versed in statistics or numeric number, while the text might be better, more accessible for lay people. So I think both are important, and maybe there are other modality as well. But again, it's a very much user-dependent question, and I tend to suggest separate that question between the method and the modality.
Thanks, Vera. So I've the rest of the schedules, and thanks everyone, by the way, for putting in your questions. They've been really good and nicely challenging for the speakers, I think. So what I'm going to do now is just share my screen again, and there we go. So I've got a few takeaways that I've sort of noted down as general points, but I think first what it might be interesting to do, if we still have Peter and Alessandra on the call, because we had a few remaining questions. So just to be fair to the people that asked them, if we could go over them again. So Peter, you've got three at the top there. So there's the first one's about introducing bias.
You're not introducing bias. Well, I mean, we're always introducing bias, but we're hoping we're reducing bias by more. There is sort of a paradigm difference here, I think, between maybe a traditional idealized view of which we heard of the sort of no confounding assumption or no additional confounding assumption, versus the reality of complex, in my case, social science world, where we're trying to approach an estimate, and whatever external knowledge and understanding we have is a model, an imperfect model, and so the best we can do is ensure that that is as informed as possible, whilst recognizing that, you know, it will be imperfect. And if the scientific system is working ideally, and that's a whole different question, then in theory, you know, other people with other perspectives will come at it from different angles, and then hopefully there'll be some kind of convergence towards something meaningful. But of course, yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer. Is my short answer to that one. The other one: what approach do you take when brainstorming variables that contribute to the system? There's still no like formal guidance on this, but I would say it clearly requires a combination of expert knowledge of the context, combined with, I would argue, some decent training in how to draw DAGs, because actually a lot of the decision making is about sort of understanding temporal flow, rather than, you know, what a lot of the focus is on identifying causes, but actually really it's understanding, if you imagine that data generating mechanism happening through time, and therefore having to sort of really think about what's going on. So usually we would try and bring together people from different domains with different expertise to try and brainstorm what we think is likely to be important, and ideally still you would actually share that with other, possibly even other communities. I mean, there's an idea with DAGs to actually create a sort of live repository where people can put their draft DAG and then say, has anyone got any critique on this? So that's a kind of growing area, but I think it's kind of similar to the first point, recognizing the subjectivity involved, and therefore trying to draw upon as wide a range of expertise as possible is usually best. And then, is adjusting for known prognostic clinical factors to determine the effect outside a causal framework dangerous? Right. So a causal framework, a causal approach always starts with what's your estimand. And, you know, it depends on the estimand, but when I hear prognostic clinical factors, I tend to imagine that these are, in a sense, determinants of the outcome. You know, they determine prognosis, rather than clearly defined kind of causal variables such as confounders. If it so happens that your prognostic clinical factors are the same as your confounding set, then it would be great. But in reality, that language looks very outcome focused, whereas if it's in a sense if it's determining the exposure, then we're actually talking about a propensity score approach. So depending on how clearly it's been defined and what additional kind of framework is applied to these concepts, then, you know, I can't say whether it's dangerous or not, but I would say that language in itself generally to me suggests a non-causal approach, and therefore one should be very cautious of interpreting those factors as having any meaning. So I don't know, is Alessandra still on the call?
Yeah, I'm here.
Could you have a stab at the other questions?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the first one is about the interesting questions, all of them. Thank you for the questions. The first one is, can the symbolic machine learning and last systems used to get the preference scores as a choice-based conjoint analysis? I think we can get the preference scores, so I didn't have enough time to go into the details, but the interesting bit about learning this kind of preference models that we have is that the models define almost a topology of preference criteria, right? So there are some criteria that are so the most preferred, and then other criteria, the other less preferred, and so forth. So solutions or suggestions that will feel, will satisfy the top criteria will come with the highest score, and there can be multiple suggestions with the same preferred score, but we can also generate solutions or suggestions that are lower scores. So the answer is yes, we can actually compute these preference scores in our system. The reason being that the kind of system that we're using is not just logic based, but ancestor programming is able of combining logic, reasoning, and inference with optimization criteria. And these optimization functions are used to compute these preference scores. So I think that's a bonus, if you like, of the kind of declarative computational environment that we are using here. We are trying to learn. So the second question: do these rule inferences related to proof assistance, and how do they represent the symbolic logic? Now, I'm not sure what is referring here to proof assistance. If I know there's a lot of work also in applying machine learning in general for fear improving. So if that's what is referred to, so we haven't tried that, but it is possible in a sense to, as I showed before with the principle of learning Hamiltonian definition of Hamiltonian graph, if there is some lemmas or some property that needs to be learn in order to continue a proof, supporting to proof, then yes, then that could be the case. You can kind of think about a proof of system like creating a separate set of data related to a certain concept that you need to learn in order to continue your proof. You can do that. How does this relate to symbolic logic? Well, it's 100% related in the sense that the language that we have is a logic-based language. It's not as expressive as the full first-order language that is clearly, undecidable. So there's no possible to have a machine learning algorithm the full first-order language. But we are the language, the first-order logic language that we learn, our modeling is very, very close to that. It's in fact, the complexity class of our learning algorithm is pretty high, but this hasn't stopped us from applying effectively the systems to real world data. Now, the third one, I don't know what is the third one. It just disappeared. I think I don't have much time, maybe. Do you see opportunity?
Sorry, my network is playing up. So
okay, so maybe you can choose the opportunity to use a discrete latent variable. Oh, this is an interesting question. This relates very much into the hybrid approach that we are trying to explore at the moment and work on. And yes, the answer is there are great opportunity here. So in the example I show with the forward pass architecture, you could think of be able to extract some latent variables, with their own level of, if you like, probability value, or estimations. And these can be injected into the context, if you like, that we're having when we label our examples. So the fact that we have a context-based example can allow also to integrate in this context any kind of latent variables, discrete latent variable that have been identified, and therefore learn models that take into account of these discrete latent variables. The extension that we're doing at the moment with probabilistic aspect will allow also to predict a posterior probability of that prediction based on the certainty or uncertainty of the latent variables. I hope this answers the questions.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. So this final section, thanks very much for the answers. Just the last kind of 15 minutes that we've got on the call here. If anyone wants to ask any further questions, then please do either type in the chat, or I think we might be able to just have people unmute. What I was going to do was suggest that we sort of structure perhaps some of the discussion, if people haven't got anything else specific, around some of the takeaways that I've got from the 4 talks. So the first point, this sort of concept of interpretation and the interpretation of the results of modeling. Peter very strongly at the start said we need causality on our models to be able to interpret properly. So that and that's potentially obviously slightly different from the interpretable machine learning approach. So there's that general question and perhaps conflicts there. The second point we have is that there's obviously some overlap in the techniques between the two fields. So there's this application or development of random forests into the more constrained causal forests that was described in the second talk. And then with the symbolic machine learning that Alessandra was describing, if we can do that probabilistically and include causal constraints, could that be an approach to learning causal models? Or are there other overlaps that might be interesting to explore from a sort of methods perspective? And then finally, who is the interpretation for, or what is the goal of the explanation, which is, well, I think the key question that Vera presented to us. And I think this arises, effectively, the question of communication arises pretty much everywhere where we're trying to explain a model or some science to someone. I know David Spiegelhalter has done quite a lot of, and his group have done a lot of work on how statistics are explained to different audiences and approaches towards doing that. And it's interesting that there is this quite large now research community in human-computer interaction and artificial intelligence, where people are studying how to understand AI models. And I wonder if there might be some common ground that can be covered between the two sort of parts of those fields, where statistics or causal model communication and AI interpretability can interact from a human understanding point of view. So if anyone's got anything to say there, or on anything else, then unmute and go for it.
I would add, I think Vera's presentation was absolutely the sort of underpinning, in that those questions, what is it, what do we really want to know? You know, that's not answering that properly, in a sense, as Vera goes along to do. But in the past, as a community, by not really answering that properly, we've wasted a lot of time by sort of thinking what is explanation and what is interpretability. And I think that identification of almost those two different elements, the how and the why, obviously, you know, I argued right at the beginning, what you know, why, if you want to answer a why question, then that's a causal question. And then you need a causal inference approach. And I think what's really interesting for me, again, as someone who isn't familiar with several of the things that then came up, is the parallels that I can see, particularly symbolic machine learning, that you know, that what you're really doing there is learning the underlying rules. And that's, you know, that's what I'm saying, is you have to start with underlying rules, and you know, and the patterns without rules are kind of, could be anything. So I think there's those two different elements, and you know, clearly causal inference lends, I think, a huge amount towards why and that perspective. And then the how bit is something I would say I haven't given as much thought to.
Yeah, I think from a HCI point of view, I think about this difference moving to causal. I think there are two sides. From the user side, I would say a lot of methods that figuring out the needs is agnostic to whatever model, whatever technique you use. For example, understand what question user might ask going from user side. The other side is also, if now we are moving causal, first is what are the new components we need people to understand. For example, maybe uncertainty become a more important component. We need to explain, we need to better present. And also, is there certain task or domain that causal model is more appropriate? So that's also important. But kind of at back of my head, kind of this high level question is also, for lay users, do they clearly understand the difference of a causal versus a non-causal model? When we talk about explanation, a lot of end user probably take it for granted everything is causal. So I would be very curious to say, now we move to this new framework, how would end user, one is how do we help end user understand the difference, and how would that kind of affect their downstream task? For example, would that affect them how they make decisions differently if now they know this is a certain causal factor there?
Yeah, and maybe I just want to add one thing. So following on Peter's point as well. So I can clearly see a strong connection between the symbolic machine learning and the causal models. In a sense, from my point of view, it's if having a model which is written kind of rule-based, or actually I want to underline is more than rule-based, because rule-based is a deterministic function, right?
Yeah.
So give us a condition to give you an output, right? So whereas we have models that they are constraints, they are non-deterministic behavior, so it's much more expressive than a rule-based model. But having such models written in a rigorous manner, in a sense that you can automatically extract from data, right, from observations, from other prior knowledge, allow you to maybe think about how you build an explanation model on top of it, right? So you can think about the constructed explanation. There are causality relations, so you can work your model backwards from your outcome. You understand what kind of part of the model is triggered the conclusion, and there are many informal reasoning mechanisms that do that. But I also agree with Vera that explanation is very much context dependent, so depending very much on the context of the humans, the user that you're referring to. Certain kind of explanation in terms of pure causality is okay, but other form of explanations, maybe counterfactual explanations, if it wasn't that the case, what would have instead happened? So this is also another form of explanation. And from my point of view, that like logic a lot, having such a logical representation allow you to put on top of it all this form of reasoning, if you like, for explanation generation.
So I didn't see if Nomi's still on the call, but actually I'd be interested to hear what Nomi, what you would have to say about that kind of goal of the explanation for, say, the policymakers that you're interacting with, and if they're implementing a policy and want to know its effects, what their goal for the original policy was in the first place, and how well defined that is, and whether that sort of influences how they interpret then the results of the study.
So I think there are, communication of this with policymakers, I think there are several challenges. One is that obviously in an ideal situation, we would be involving policymakers to design the study from the beginning. So we would, for example, know the propensity score or know what our instrumental variables would be. Even if we can't convince them to randomize, we would have a much better idea about whether those assumptions which we are willing to make are really worth making, or the results would be just rubbish and misleading. So I think that's one thing. And I think that those conversations with the policymaker, I think those have to be around the assumptions, and that's all. I think that can be done in plain English or Indonesian and other languages. In terms of what particular estimator we are using to get to that propensity score, to get that outcome regression, to estimate some high dimensional function, I think that shouldn't matter, and I think it is yeah, so I think that's kind of the job of it's almost like the technical part of the science, but the real kind of human scientist interaction has to be around the design and the assumptions, these potential outcomes, like asking questions like, what is the counterfactual here? In health economics, where I'm working, we call this decision problems, and it is it's a very commonly used thought experiment when we, for example, thinking about a new drug to introduce to a market. So what would be the counterfactual of not introducing the drug? The drug would not be available at all, or maybe only certain people got it. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can do in much better and better structured way, but I think that doesn't have to involve lots of equations and maths. So that's why I also really enjoyed Vera's talk. It seems to give us some sort of formal toolkit to do that.
I would just very briefly add, this is one of the things I like most of all about a causal inference approach, is that whereas perhaps I grew up doing more traditional modeling, we would just have a model that you would then try and describe. But because, in a sense, you're forced down to the path of very clearly defining an S demand, it isn't very hard to then move towards answering very practical questions along the lines of, what would happen if you stopped smoking, or what would happen if you took this drug? And I think, that's clearly how we have to be extracting the information from our model if we're then trying to communicate it with other people, because that's the language that comes back to the types of questions that are being asked. That's the language we've got to turn it back into to make it useful.
Yeah. And maybe one more thing here. I mean, there was this little discussion about logistic regression and differences between machine learning and statistics. There are no differences, and also logistic regression. I don't think that most, practitioners, doctors, or policymakers understand an odds ratio really, really well, or logistic regression, unless they go horse racing, or not racing, but betting on horses. But I mean, I don't really get odds ratios properly either. So that's really just a technical difference, whether someone doesn't a little bit gets logistic regression or not quite, or someone gets random forest a little bit but not quite. I think the technical details should be like the statisticians should be trusted on that.
So we haven't had any. Oh, we had an additional question for Peter there, just about the open safely data and whether that's been reanalyzed within a causal framework. Do you know?
I don't think it has. Because it's a relatively new data set, despite the name, it is not yet, in a sense, freely open. You can't just log in and analyze it. So even if someone was doing that, I would imagine there'd be quite a delay between starting that and being able to demonstrate otherwise. I think you would, for certain things, obviously see quite different answers. Because it's a sense a very different question when you're asking what is the contribution of each of these variables versus just developing a prediction model. But I'm not aware of anyone having done that.
So thanks very much. We have reached the top of the hour, which means that our workshop has officially come to a close. I just want to say thank you so much again to each of our speakers. I've been badgering them with emails, and they've been all extremely good at responding and arranging for a technical rehearsal yesterday, and all has worked out really nicely. 4 fantastic talks. Thank you very much to Lutz from the Royal Society for sorting out our technical problems and managing the team's accounts. And with regards to sharing slides, would the presenters be happy if we shared your slides? Yep, great. Okay, we can share those then. Yes, I think we've had several people who'd be interested in looking at those. So, yep, thanks very much, and I'll let you get on with your Tuesday evening. Thanks, or afternoon for you, Vera.
Thanks, Richard.
Cheers. Bye for now, everyone.